Where is the productivity? Curtis Cox, the supervisor of standards and methods, is getting apoplectic. I see foreign cars in the parking lot, he says. The owners say they are cheaper. How is this country going to compete? The GM people practically weep when they think about Japan. All those nice, industrious workers singing the alma mater in the morning. Hail to thee, O Mitsubishi. Whistling on their way to work like the seven dwarfs. For God's sake, never a strike, never a crossword. Playing on the company teams, asking the foreman if it's okay to get engaged to this very nice girl as soon as the foreman meets her. So I asked General Motors, quite routinely, if I can go see this apogee of American industrialism. Say, Tuesday, and General Motors says no, never. I admit to being a bit stunned. Do they not fly planeloads of people there all the time? Did they not fly alleged same planeloads at the end of the GM strike, together with appropriate refreshment, to watch the first Vega come off the line, with a handout about how the Vega was going to Mrs. Sadie Apple Pie, library assistant of Huckleberry Finn, Illinois, with a quote already from Mrs. Apple Pie? "Oh, I have been waiting so long for my Vega. I can't believe it's finally here. I'm so excited." Did they not? What do they mean? No? Not that guy? Who the hell do they think I am, Ralph Nader? I begin thumbing my other notebook that has the number of the payphone in the hallway of Nader's boarding house. And it's off to Lordstown. Because even with plant guards, General Motors is not Russia. And anybody who has graduated from the good old U.S. Army knows how to deal with the lower levels of great bureaucracies. "Where are you going with that rake?" "What rake, sir?" "That rake." "Oh, this rake, the captain?" "Sir?" "He said take it over there." "What captain?" "The other captain." "What other captain?" "Beats me, Lieutenant. They just told me take the rake." So we are walking around the plant at Lordstown, all $250 million of it very visible, like an iron and steel tropical rainforest, with the electric drills screaming like parakeets, and the Unimate robot welders bending over the Vegas like big mother birds, and the Prince Valiants of Local 1112, zanking away with their new expensive electrical equipment. Vegas grow before your eyes. Beautiful. I recommend it, next time you are taking the Howard Johnson tour across the land of the free. But what are these cars waiting for repair? Marked, no high beam signal, dome light inoperative, no brakes. No brakes? No brakes. But what is this on the bulletin board? Management has experienced serious losses of production due to poor quality workmanship, deliberate restriction of output, failure or refusal to perform job assignments, and sabotage. Efforts to discourage such actions through the normal application of corrective discipline have not been successful. Accordingly, any further misconduct of this type will be considered cause for severe disciplinary measures, including dismissal. Corrective discipline? My God, you can get court-martialed in this place? They should have an industrial psychologist read the language on the bulletin board. I can hear the glee club louder. Hail to thee, O fair Toyota. Hi there. Hi. What is that? That's the window trim. Is this a good place to work? Well, it will be as soon as we get it shaped up. Would you buy one of these cars? Sure, if it wasn't so expensive. It's a well-engineered little car. Wouldn't you rather be out on your own, say, a garage? Nah, a garage don't have no benefits. Say, I don't want to bother you. 2 of those Vegas just went by without window trim. Well, they all go by without something. This line is moving too fast. That's productivity, man. Oh, is that what they call it? I can give you a few notes of our brilliantly unscientific survey of Lordstown, but they are just that. Our people would rather have had the time off than the overtime, but their wives worked because they needed the extra income. They would tell their brothers to get a job there, and in fact some of them did. Supervisors bugged everybody. Sabotage? Beer cans welded to the inside of a fender? Well, there might be a few hotheads, but that's silly. Man, the Vega is our bread and butter. The more Vegas they sell, the better for us. If the foreman bugged our people too much, they would get another job somewhere else. They took for granted there would be such a job. We asked the older types if the young bucks were any different. They said, yes. They're smarter. They don't put up with what we did. Our favorite Prince Valiant haircut said, I am not going to bust my ass for anybody. I don't even bust my ass for myself, you know. working around the house. But beware, one has to be an epistemological agnostic considering any such report, whether done by journalists or social scientists. How do we know people who talk to us are representative of a workforce of 10,000? Further, journalists and social scientists are verbal, conceptual people. They would probably score very low in electrical repairs around the house. Unconsciously, they feel. How do they stand it? I wouldn't like to work here. They did not sleep through senior year in high school with Sister Maria Teresa droning on about Wordsworth and look at the plant as a relief from that. My companion Bill once did a piece about labor for the New York Times Magazine, and some paragraphs were picked up by a social scientist writing a paper. When he subsequently went to do research for a book, properly in awe of all the academic sources, he found the sources quoting him. A second social scientist quoted the first, with appropriate footnotes, and a third quoted the second, with footnotes and notes, and so on the old beagle pack and cry. This doesn't mean the job can't be done, but it takes a large, thorough, well-funded effort, with the appropriate discipline of statistics and all the modes and variants in place. So all right, it makes sense to have a demurrer for the statistical discipline. But the feeling is there, something else is going on. The world is not necessarily going to settle back to the 4th of July, Eisenhower Regency, with life all quieted down. The key phrases are from the Xerox of the Xerox of the Xerox of the confidential memo at Ford. The next key phrases are from the banks of the Charles River. Lordstown is the biggest and bestest example from industrial America, and the Harvard Business School is the West Point of capitalism, or at least so its denizens tell each other. And certainly the place has provided one of the great old boy networks of modern times. Let a business school type follow up out there in the world, and he need not fear. Another business school type will come to his rescue, and they will call it merger, or recapitalization, or synergy, or something. I have 2 straws in the wind to submit from the West Point of capitalism. Admittedly, these come from an unusual time. 2 years before, the greedy little bastards in investment management could hardly wait to get going on their first $5 million, as I said before. Now there is a new crop of greedy little bastards. Naturally, the course is still wildly popular, but outside, the Cambodian invasion has been timed neatly with my spring visit. The feeling that all is not well in the world has even penetrated the clouds of greed in my 3 sections. Around Harvard Square, the graffiti was getting political. Nobody had written Heloise loves Abelard in quite a while. Instead, this flowed in large letters for a third of a block. John Hancock was a revolutionary, not an obscene life insurance salesman. But that, of course, was on the college side of the Charles River, where the lifestyle is different. Beards and mustaches and poor boy clothes, almost as much a uniform as the gray flannel jackets and khaki pants of a generation before. But across the river at the business school, the budding apparatchiks are coming to class in Brooks Brothers suits and button-down white shirts, looking like sub-assistant secretaries in the Nixon administration. There is no revolutionary chatter in the course catalog at the B school. You find one of the major preoccupations of the catalog is control. The field of control deals with the collection, processing, analysis, and use of quantitative information in a business. In a previous year, when an SDS faction took over University Hall in the college and there was a big bust, the college as an institution seemed very confused, but the business school had a contingency plan in a fat binder with colored index tabs. I had the classes at that time too, and one B school faculty member, fearing some Dickensian Carmagnole in the streets, Paris, 1789, said of the dissenters, "They'll never make it to this side of the river. We'll blow the bridges first." So, this is not the last bastion. It is not Bob Jones University or even Utah State. It is where they grow the apparatchiks, the technicians who sop up the top spots a generation hence, and if something else is going on, these types will either lead it or fight it, or try to take it over after it gets going. First straw, notes from A class. The guest lecturer has posed a case. You are running a portfolio of $100 million. Baby stuff. You are in a competition, not unlike the one the Chase Manhattan runs among competing money managers. The worst performing portfolio managers at the end of a certain time get fired. The best get more money to run, and presumably appropriate rewards. Company A is a notorious polluter, but its profits are unimpaired. Company B is buying anti-pollution equipment that will depress its profits for years. Other things being equal, which do you buy, A or B? The case was not too far from reality. Ralph Nader's project on corporate responsibility was trying to put some people on the General Motors board, and Harvard owns 305,000 shares of General Motors. Harvard's treasurer reportedly said he was going to vote for management because they are our kind of people, after which both faculty and students generated a furious debate. The case is not only limited to pollution. The same principles of the social purpose of investment can be applied to defense contractors, the makers of napalm, companies with investments, or branches in South Africa, and so on. All right, you want to achieve performance in your portfolio, and this performance is being measured competitively. It may affect your career. Do you buy Company A, the profitable polluter, or Company B, the unprofitable anti-polluter? Student 1. I would try to evaluate the long-term effect because in the long run, Company B is going to have a better image. Student 2. But in the long run, you would have lost the account. I think you have to know the wishes of the constituency. If it's a fund, how do the fund holders feel? What do they want? Scattered boos. The class begins to chant. A or B, A or B. Several other students offer comments, all trying to hedge, to keep both the profit and the social purpose. Student 3. I buy the polluter. Cheers, then scattered boos. It isn't the business of a fund manager to make a social decision, or to discriminate between companies on his own ideas of some social purpose. That could be dangerous. If we want to combat pollution, let society vote for it, and have a consensus. I doubt that consumers really want to pay the price. You can't ask profit-making organizations to subsidize society. The radical student. The radical student is only radical by standards of this side of the river, which is to say that he is neatly shaven but is wearing a colored shirt and a tie that is a bit wider than the 1955 width. Maybe that's the problem. Everything in this school is geared to the purpose of the corporation, and that purpose is maximized profit. We ask the radical student, what are the goals of a corporation if not to maximize profit? Silence in the classroom, a rustling of papers. The idea is very confusing. What are the goals of a corporation if not to maximize profit? Not a hand goes up. It is just too hairy a question. We ask it once more. More shuffling. An occasional left wrist shoots out from the cuff with the wristwatch exposed. The radical student. You know the trouble? It's the way we look at it. We're concerned with property rights. At the law school, say, they talk about civil rights. We're objective, but maybe objectivity has been overdone. Is our one purpose to measure things? My second straw is the resolution. This was, as I said, an emotional time. The business school voted and passed this, then bought an ad in the Wall Street Journal to publicize it. The resolution called for American withdrawal from Southeast Asia, not startling for a student resolution at that time. But this was the business school, normally heavily Republican in 1968, and it was the language juxtaposed to the source that was startling. We condemn the administration of President Nixon for its view of mankind, and the American community which, 1. Perceives the anxiety and turmoil in our midst as the work of bums and effete snobs. 2. Fails to acknowledge that legitimate doubt exists about the ability of black Americans and other depressed groups to obtain justice. 3. Is unwilling to move for a transformation of American society in accordance with the goals of maximum fulfillment for each human being and harmony between mankind and nature. Harmony between mankind and nature? I asked the former dean of admissions, what was this about harmony between mankind and nature? When had that crept into the business school? I don't know, he said. I guess it means they're not going to work for Procter & Gamble and make those dishwasher soaps that don't dissolve and smother the lakes. They don't want to work for big companies anyway, or so they say. I'd like to see what they say a couple of years out. The big companies treat them as objects, they say. In the 50s, the guys here all wanted to get to the top of Procter & Gamble. In the 60s, it was finance. Last year, I said, My classes all wanted to go right to work for a hedge fund. You couldn't even offer them $20,000 a year because they were going to run $5 million into 10 in a year and take 20% of the gain. I used to say, "Good morning, greedy little bastards." The guys in the 50s said the ex-dean wanted to run the big company, and the guys in the 60s wanted to be Danny Lufkin. Make a big bundle by the time you're 40 and run for something. And now? And now they're just confused. I've never seen such malaise. I don't think the big companies have gotten the message yet, and maybe the Fortune 500 can run without the Harvard Business School. But I have the feeling something will give on one side or the other. More recently, I talked to the same ex-dean, who now teaches a popular course, and asked him what changes there had been. Popular journalism had said that things were back to normal, whatever that was. Nader's Raiders had been swamped with applicants in the emotional summers, and now the young law students were scuffling in the line when the man from Sullivan and Cromwell came to interview. It was said pro bono was over. The law students didn't even want the social courses anymore. They wanted taxation and trusts and corporations. Were the current B school classes still holding out on the big corporations? Were the big corporations bending at all? They're bending to the extent that they don't come and interview the wives and tell them they have to fit to corporate life and move 14 times in 15 years, he said. But other than that, all you can say is that they're conscious of some change. As for my students, I think they have an acceptance of corporate life, and they're looking for something inner. I hear a lot about lifestyles, how they want a non-anxious working life. They don't want to have one of them called a dumbbell life, which is to say a blob of work at one end, a blob of home life at the other, and a conduit between, a railroad or a freeway. There's a lot of stuff about walking on the beach, that the worthy cause is themselves, and that work should fit life, not the other way around. And they talk a lot about intimate relationships, wives, children, and so on. So if I had to divide the decades again, I would still say that the 50s produced the corporate man who would rise to the top and die 17 months after retirement, leaving a beautiful estate. The 60s students wanted a piece of the action, and currently the fantasy is a balanced life, just enough success to include it all. They want to run things, but not at any cost. They still want power, but now they want love too. Maximum fulfillment for each human being? Harmony between man and nature? That's not the old business school. How do you put those things into a balance sheet? Can we operate a corporate society without objectivity? Or at least what is passed for objectivity? I wrote in my notes, will General Motors believe in the harmony between man and nature? Will General Electric believe in beauty and truth? It is not, of course, a revolutionary idea in the limited history of capitalism in this country to make something for less than a maximum profit. First of all, profit was not necessarily something that could be controlled. It came like the rain on the crops, between the costs and the market. Moreover, when the bulk of business was family-owned, its purpose was to take care of the family, sons, nephews, and so on, and of the product's reputation, if it had a reputation of value. So a wagon maker could simply make a good wagon, and a book publisher could publish an author simply because he wanted to. What we have come to call social purpose was a matter of individual integrity, randomly and haphazardly applied. But these businesses sold out to bigger ones, and those in turn to bigger ones. Supercurrency, that New York Stock Exchange listing, that broad market with the stock selling at a fancy multiple, the sons of the founders with Caribbean estates, and the grandsons in their pads all secure to blow their minds with 3K electronic guitar apparatus, and not worry about work because the supercurrency has been salted and peppered into hundreds of trusts so the taxman cannot get it. Only the supercurrency has to stay super. The profits have to keep growing. The multiple has to go up, and the accountants can't do it all. Multi-million-dollar businesses can't be run by intuition or seat-of-the-pants engineering. There has to be objectivity, whatever that is, and the continuous quantification of results. We have to have what the course catalog at the school calls a rigorous and systematic approach. That is, the collection, processing, analysis, reporting, and use of quantitative information. But there is competition, maybe, and the judgment of those crazy crapshooters up in New York. If the earnings go down, they will bomb the stock. And then what will our report card as a manager look like? For our man in the green eye shade asking how goes the world, How will it go? The harmony between man and nature becomes an important question, and not just a spiritual one. Nobody is against such harmony. When ecology first crept into the scene, industry seized it as an advertising opportunity. Not a filter was bought that the buyer didn't take an ad about cleaning up the rivers and waters. In fact, at one point, someone figured out that more was spent drumbeating about cleanup than on the equipment. Industry began to sense that the public belief that more was better was beginning to fall away. Union Carbide dropped its slogan, "There's a little bit of Union Carbide in everybody's home." They wanted you to think of the plastics in the sandwich bags, and instead a little bit of Union Carbide meant, "The wind's shifted. Here it comes again. Shut the doors, close the windows. You know what it cost to have the curtains cleaned last time?" President Nixon gave an ecology speech, and somebody slipped him a real good quote from T.S. Eliot. "Clean the air, clean the sky, wash the wind. That's what we were going to do," said the president, not realizing that the very same quote went on. "Take stone from stone and wash them. Wash the stone, wash the bone, wash the brain, wash the soul. Wash them, wash them." Not ecology at all, but the blood of murder in the cathedral. But while everybody agrees that mankind and nature should live in harmony, few agree on what that means, or how the cost shall be borne. They have not changed the consciousness of the way they think. To paraphrase University of Colorado economist Kenneth Boulding, man has lived through history in a cowboy economy, with illimitable plains and reckless, exploitative, romantic, and violent behavior. Consumption was linear, that is, materials were extracted from supposed infinite resources, and waste was tossed into infinite dumps. But we are shifting to a spaceman economy. The Earth is becoming finite. Like a closed spaceship, consumption must become circular, that is, to conserve what we have. Resources must be continuously recycled through the system. Air and water have always been free, and few realize that we are approaching the point in our cowboy ways where we will wrench the Earth's ecology out of shape. In the closing circle, biologist-ecologist Barry Commoner writes that we have to reconsider the true value of the conventional capital accumulated by the operation of the economic system. We have not considered the true cost. The effect of the operation of the system on the value of its biological capital needs to be taken into account in order to obtain a true estimate of the overall wealth-producing capability of the system. The course of environmental deterioration shows that as conventional capital has accumulated, for example in the United States since 1946, the value of the biological capital has declined. Indeed, if the process continues, the biological capital may eventually be driven to the point of total destruction. Since the usefulness of conventional capital in turn depends on the existence of the biological capital, the ecosystem, when the latter is destroyed, the usefulness of the former is also destroyed. Thus, despite its apparent prosperity, in reality the system is being driven into bankruptcy. Environmental degradation represents a crucial, potentially fatal, hidden factor in the operation of the economic system. So we do not even have a true picture of how well we have done. This parallels the arguments of the British economist Ezra Michon. If a wage earner dies sooner because of exposure to mercury, radiation, and DDT, but doesn't have extra medical bills, is there not still the cost of the lost earnings from the extra years? They have to be assigned a value, even if the human anguish of the missing years is ignored. According to Commoner, intense environmental pollution in the United States has come with the technological transformation of the productive system since World War II. Production based on the new technologies has been more profitable than the older technologies they replaced. That is, the newer, more polluting techniques yield higher profits. We could, of course, survive with new technologies, new systems to return sewage and garbage to the soil, retire land from cultivation, replace synthetic pesticides with biological ones, recycle usable materials, and cut down the uses of power. That would cost about $600 billion, or a quarter of our current capital plant. Placed in the kind of terms used in the analyst societies, this debt to nature means there is suddenly a liability on the balance sheet we didn't know was there. It must have been in the footnotes in fine print. We have been very profitable, but the plant is falling down. We can build a new plant, but we are going to have to amortize the charges against earnings for a long time. Ah, but then we have a spanking new plant. Isn't that good? Not in the terms necessarily that we have been used to considering as good. Of course, if we survive, that's good, and perhaps even prevent life from getting more noxious, that's good. But we have been measuring good as profitable. New capital expenditures are, at some point, supposed to increase the profits. That is why the class is so confused when asked what the purpose of the corporation is. Good is profitable. Profitable is new technology. New technology has been pollutive and profitable. Killing whales is very profitable until the day when there are no more whales, because we have only been amortizing the ships and the radar and the depth charges and harpoons. We haven't amortized the whales, and anyway, how do you replace whales? But the debt to nature, paid, does not increase either productivity or profitability. Thus, probably the corporation is not going to pay up unless the society compels it, induces it, inveigles it, or brings it about in some other way. The vision of good is simply too far removed from the vision of what has been perfectly good in the hundreds of years of cowboy economics. This is going to be true not just for the United States and not just for capitalism. The Cellulose, Paper and Carton Administration of the Ministry of Timber, Paper, and Woodworking in the USSR is going to have its problems, too. It has its quotas, and the boys at the ministry get their satisfactions from churning out the stuff, and ecology freaks are everywhere. This is from Professor Marshall Goldman's account of the pollution of Lake Baikal, the world's oldest lake and largest body of fresh water by volume. The manager of the plant at Bratsk is asked why a new waste filter has not been installed. Says he, "It's expensive. The Ministry of Timber, Paper and Woodworking is trying to invest as few funds as possible in the construction of paper and timber enterprises in order to make possible the attainment of good indices per ruble of capital investment. These indices are being achieved by the refusal to build purification installations. The finite earth argument leads almost inexorably to a call for an end to growth, both in population and industrial output. Growth in industrial output is one of the justifications for both capitalism and socialism, each to each. When Khrushchev talked about burying us, he was bragging about increases in industrial production. Increases in our gross national product have been hailed as the triumph of our system. Leave aside for a moment what GNP measures. It does measure only quantity, so if everybody goes and buys triple locks for their doors because crime has increased so much, the GNP goes up, though the quality of life may have gone down. There are those who believe we should attempt to measure such quality. The most dramatic assault on growth came from a group at MIT headed by Dennis Meadows, which built a mathematical model of the world system with the interrelationships of population, food supply, natural resources, pollution, and industrial production. The Meadows group produced a doomsday equation. The world is out of business in less than a century, unless the will is generated to begin a controlled, orderly transition from growth to global equilibrium. Even new technologies such as nuclear power sources, said the group, wouldn't help much. The team doubled the resources and assumed that recycling cut the demand to 1/4. Even optimistic estimates didn't put the day of doom off longer than 2100. We are going to stop growing one way or the other, said the group, the other being the collapse of the industrial base through depleted resources, and then lack of food and medical services. This report did not lack for critics. One economist said it was Malthus, with lights and a computer. Others said the base was too skimpy for the assumptions, and that future science and future technology were unknown. If you had assumed our population growth in 1880 without the automobile, you could have assumed asphyxiation by horse manure. If materials were going to become visibly scarce, would not the prices begin to anticipate scarcity? And would not new materials and new power sources be developed? The representatives of less developed countries who considered the report at a Smithsonian symposium were particularly alarmed, because freezing growth without some sort of worldly distribution of income would keep them at their current levels. The poorer nations, said the Indian ambassador, would slide down to starvation. At another international conference, the Malaysians said, "Some of us would rather see smoke coming out of a factory and men employed than no factory." And we are not concerned with pollution, but with existence. At the laissez-faire end of the spectrum, economists like the University of Chicago's Milton Friedman think that in arguments over social issues, there is a strong tendency for people to substitute their own values for the values of others. The current pollution concern is an upper-income demand. The high-income people want to get the low-income people to pay for something that the high-income people value. People move from the clear, clean countryside to the polluted cities, not the other way around, because the advantages of the city outweigh the disadvantages. Left alone, people are more likely to act in their own interests, to evaluate the costs and benefits of their own activities. It is, of course, hard to legislate changes in consciousness. But most economists are unwilling to give up growth as a goal. World population is certain to grow for many years to come, an extra billion between 1960 and 1975, 3 more billion in the next quarter century. Even if that rate of increase is slowed, you need growth just to keep pace. In a world of no growth but more people, you only accomplish one person's well-being, or one nation's, at the expense of another. That is the kind of redistribution of wealth we had before there was any surplus wealth to compound, when people in skins hit each other over the head with mastodon thigh bones to accomplish the redistribution. Presumably, we have only recently outgrown such activity, and the record of social maturity is not a record anybody would trust to the application of economic problems. So the doomsday equations have at least the virtue of getting people to think about the problems of a finite earth. It will take long enough to do something about it anyway. It is from the increments that poverty is alleviated and the goals of the society met. If there are social problems, such as pollution, that can't be met by the market mechanism. They can be met by a pricing system, penalizing the polluter, let us say, or giving a tax incentive to achieve the desired end. This is not a net gain to growth in the traditional ways we have measured growth, because the stimulus from investments in pollution control is outweighed by the price rise in the end product, hence a damper on total demand. A study prepared for the Council on Environmental Quality, a government office, indicated this could be done for a small percentage of annual GNP, less than 1% for air and water. What is the impact of all this on the man in the green eyeshade, considering how goes the world? In the short run, and the short run is all that is considered by many of the men in green eyeshades, he can continue to play the game of displacement, who makes the needles. If the Meadows model were to be true, and we were to be closer to doomsday, and the pricing mechanism were left alone, the man in the green eyeshade could make incredible killings by buying up commodities on the eve of their disappearance. But in the longer run, the demand for social purposes, whether in pollution control or health, education and welfare, is going to come out of the savings flow. Institutional Investor magazine polled 41 of the nation's leading academic, governmental, and business economists, and 2/3 of them believe that A. Growth should continue, with a change in priorities, and B. That additional income wealth redistribution is required. If the government borrows in the capital markets to deliver, it tips the balance we discussed in an earlier chapter. If it raises taxes to deliver, that comes at least partially out of profits. And if it, in effect, prints the money to deliver, then inflation also will cut into profits. As is often said in this sort of discussion, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. There are some items to be balanced against this. One is the value of the compound in a trillion-dollar economy. One is the growing role of services in the economy. By 1980, the Department of Labor says more will be employed in services than in manufacturing. Services are non-pollutive, but the productivity curve also begins to flatten because there are no economies of scale from doctors, teachers, barbers, and string quartets. The man in the green eyeshade is a capitalist and a manager. The capitalist and managerial classes may see, writes Robert Heilbroner in Between Capitalism and Socialism, the nature and nearness of the ecological crisis, and may come to accept a smaller share of the national surplus simply because they recognize that there is no alternative. Some conclusions are inescapable. Even if the ecological crisis is overstated and far away, even if social problems can be solved with the existing mechanism, both of those points arguable, the consensus is moving away from the market as decision maker and from the business society. As soon as you get all the articulation of goals and priorities, you are moving from decision-making by market to decision-making by political philosophy. This is an idea developed by Daniel Bell, both in the End of Ideology and in the Post-Industrial State, and by others. What's good for General Motors is good for the country, said Charlie Wilson, one of Eisenhower's businessman cabinet members. It would be interesting to see year by year what percentage of the people agree with that, and to watch the change. So the money manager in the metaphorical green eye shade will no longer be operating in a world where the market determines totally what is produced and induced, nor in a society run by business decisions. Capital is scarcer and profits are thinner. He is still looking for 3 stocks that will double, but the range of his options is less. He has always looked not just at profits, epsilon, but at the rate of change in estimated profits, epsilon plus delta epsilon, and in the long run, the broad run, the macro scene, whatever, his expectations are diminished. Open-ended expectations are an integral part of the markets we have grown up to know. Without them, the calculators can calculate the rates of return, and everybody can be on their way home at 10:05 a.m. to work on their leisure time, or more likely, to attend some committee meeting that will be devised to take up the remaining hours. The expectations are what Keynes called animal spirits. A large proportion of our positive activities depend on spontaneous optimism rather than on a mathematical expectation, whether moral or hedonistic or economic. Most, probably, of our decisions to do something positive, the full consequences of which will be drawn out over many days to come, can only be taken as a result of animal spirits, of a spontaneous urge to action rather than inaction, and not as the outcome of a weighted average of quantitative benefits multiplied by quantitative probabilities. Thus, if the animal spirits are dimmed and the spontaneous optimism falters, leaving us to depend on nothing but a mathematical expectation, enterprise will fade and die, though fears of loss may have a basis no more reasonable than hopes of profit had before. Individual initiative will only be adequate when reasonable calculation is supplemented and supported by animal spirits, so that the thought of ultimate loss which often overtakes pioneers, as experience undoubtedly tells us in them, is put aside as a healthy man put aside the expectation of death. None of this will happen tomorrow, and it was also Keynes who said that, in the long run, we are all dead, and that the conventions by which we operated were a succession of short terms. Those looking at the long run did so at their own peril. We have a marketplace in which it is possible to float all the services as well as the manufactures, and so probably many happy hours of playing with the displacements await our men. But if we are to give up the illimitable plains of the cowboy economy, the new and smaller horizon is going to affect our ability to believe that we can compound and extrapolate with impunity, that the 3 hot ones we heard about at lunch today can go from 5 to 100. We have already lost our gunslingers, a phrase I once applied to some of our citizens, and if our big sky goes, we will have to give up some of our fantasies. But they always were fantasies anyway, and maybe there are other energies to make our wheels spin. Having thus dispatched the spirit of capitalism, let us see what we can do with the Protestant ethic. That phrase describes a devotion to thrift and industry, postponed pleasure and hard work, the hustle as approved by the Lord. It accompanied the Puritan temper, a rather forbidding and pleasure-shy view of life, and is aptly described in the confidential Ford memo together with the complaint that it is disappearing, the traditional work ethic, the concept that hard work is a virtue and a duty, will undergo additional erosion. You have already seen the seeds of conflict, because if Prince Valiant at the Pink Elephant says, "I'm not going to bust my ass for anybody, I don't even bust my ass for myself," it is safe to say he does not believe that hard work is a virtue and a duty. We may keep using the phrase Protestant ethic, everybody does, but for the record we should now split Protestant from ethic. We call it that because Max Weber called it that in one of the classic works of political economics, and the sociologists and political economists are still sending students to the paperback stores for Max Weber, and not just for the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. The textile families of northern France, Catholics all, sent letters to their sons and to each other that could have gone right into Die Protestantische Ethik. Weber did not say, of course, that Protestantism was the sole cause of capitalism. In his commentary on Weber, Julian Freund says that the Protestant ethic was at least in part a reaction against Marx's solely economic motive. Embryo capitalism had existed in other societies, Babylonian, Indian, Chinese, and Roman, but the spirit of capitalism only developed with the mystery-less, magic-free character of Protestantism, with its rationality and rationalization. This will come up again in a moment in the counterculture's objections. The accompanying asceticism of Protestantism said that you worked hard in your calling to succeed, a sign of election by God, but did not spend the wealth created, because only sobriety pleased God. Thus the Puritan came to accumulate capital without cease. Even Keynes's assumptions in Essays in Persuasion seem to be based on a kind of Protestant society, where wealth increases because the margin between production and consumption increases. Talk about industry, thrift, and the way to salvation. The Protestant ethic has found its happiest current home in a very non-Protestant country, at least in name, Japan. A while back on a visit, I would ask people in Japan, "How much vacation do you take a year?" And the answers would come back, 2 days, 1 day, 3 days. Why so little? Well, if you work on your vacation, you get paid more, and the beaches are too crowded anyway. And I remember sitting with the translator of my own book, himself a distinguished director of the Bank of Japan, everybody cross-legged, a sliver of raw fish poised between his chopsticks, a garden scene framed perfectly by the door. In the 1960s, said the honorable director, our total output passed Italy, France, Germany, and England. At this rate, we will pass the USSR in 1979. How? Our people save 20% of their wages. No other country saves so much. In the U.S., it is closer to 6%. It is indeed, and when sour years come and the people clutch a little and the savings rate goes up to 8%, the president gathers his economic advisors to Camp David and wants to know what the hell is wrong with the consumer. How do we get him to loosen up? Of course, said the director's research assistant, we will not pass the United States until... And everybody stopped talking because that was not courteous. Sometime in the 1990s, said the director, and many things could happen by then. We have social overhead building up. But we have done this without resources, without oil, without surplus food, said the assistant. With industry and thrift, industry and thrift. The voices in Osaka rise to haunt the finite earth model builders. In the morning, alma mater. For the building of a new Japan, let's put our strength and minds together, doing our best to promote production, sending our goods to the people of the world, endlessly and continuously, like water gushing from a fountain. Grow, industry, grow, grow, grow. Harmony and sincerity. Matsushita Electric, Matsushita Electric. Industry and thrift, dedication and devotion. You could imagine the United States without them, but not without the mythology and ethic behind them. What is at stake is the happiness of Arthur Burns, whether we will always have a cost-push inflation, whether we stay nation number one like President Nixon wanted, and what happened to our dreams of becoming rich. Nothing unambitious about that either. Once again, the Ford memo. For many, the traditional motivations of job security, money reward, and opportunity for personal advancement are proving insufficient. Insufficient. Security, money, and personal advancement? Do you know what we have to throw off to get to this point? I give you the Honorable Cotton Mather. There are 2 callings to be minded by all Christians. Every Christian hath a general calling, which is to serve the Lord Jesus Christ, and save his own soul. And every Christian hath also a personal calling, or a certain particular employment by which his usefulness in his neighborhood is distinguished. A Christian at his 2 callings is a man in a boat, rowing for heaven. If he mind but one of his callings, be it which it will, he pulls the oar but on one side of the boat, and will make but a poor dispatch to the shore of eternal blessedness. Every Christian should have some special business, so he may glorify God by doing good for others and getting of good for himself. To be without a calling, as 'tis against the 4th commandment, so 'tis against the 8th, which bids men seek for themselves a comfortable subsistence. If he follow no calling, a man is impious toward God, unrighteous toward his family, toward his neighborhood, toward the commonwealth. It is not enough that a Christian have an occupation, but he must mind it, and give a good account, with diligence, and so on to Poor Richard's Almanac. A sleeping fox catches no poultry. One day is worth 2 tomorrows. Diligence is the mother of good luck. Early to bed and early to rise provides a man with job security, money reward, and opportunity for personal advancement. The extension of this ethic into industrial America was a real triumph. The Ford vice president has a distinct problem. It is very hard to think of working on the line as a calling. Cotton Mather's listeners did not take this lightly, nor did he. Man and his posterity will gain but little by a calling whereto God hath not called him. A calling was to be agreeable, as well as allowable. It does make work seem softer and more important to have been prayed for. It is a wonderful inconvenience for a man to have a calling that won't agree with him. See to it, O parents, that when you choose callings for your children, you wisely consult their capacities and their inclinations, lest you ruin them. And cry mightily to God by prayer, yea, with fasting and prayer, for his direction when you are to resolve upon a matter of such considerable consequence. But, O children, you should also be thoughtful and prayerful, when you are going to fix upon your callings, and above all propose deliberately right ends unto yourselves in what you do. It is a bit hard to imagine then, Ma, I fasted and prayed and sought the wisdom of God. I know my calling, and I am going to work on the line at Ford, $4.57 an hour as an assembler. It seems almost simplistic to suggest, but you are more likely to bust your ass when everybody has been fasting and praying for you and what you are doing in your oar of the boat on the way to the shore of eternal blessedness than if none of these things are true. And if you are Ford, you have an extra problem if that spirit has departed. Not that it has departed everywhere. It is still in the literature. Ralph Waldo Emerson's self-reliance and wealth are in a direct line from Cotton Mather and Poor Richard. Be not only industrious, be clever, absorb and invest. Bishop Lawrence, doyen of the Episcopal Church at the turn of the century, really did say, in the long run, it is only to the man of morality that wealth comes. Godliness is in league with riches. Some of our major corporations have institutional advertising even today that could have been written by the social Darwinists. And Dale Carnegie courses run on principles that were devised by Benjamin Franklin. The man who gets ahead in business reads the Wall Street Journal every business day. Did you ever see the television commercial about the man who gets ahead in business? Business is a field event, pole vaulting, and the bar is set at about 100 feet. And the poor bastard is there in his business suit and his Knox hat and his briefcase. And he looks up nervously at this bar 100 feet high and fingers the pole uncertainly. After knocking the bar off the first time, he makes it the second, presumably because he has read the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal may be one of the best papers in the country, but I suggest that anyone who sees his job as a 100-foot pole vault with no track shoes is in the wrong calling and should pray for guidance. While the literature of the Protestant ethic has been exhorting everybody for 300 years in this country to be industrious and thrifty, sober and wise, to postpone gratification, in the words of the scholars, another literature has sprung up. It is literature really only in the McLuhanesque sense, but it is with us every day, and that is advertising. The purpose of the advertising is not to get you to produce and save, but to spend, to buy the goods, and this has been the case since at least 50 years ago, when mass marketing and mass advertising really got going. Now we have commercials in living color, and the populace spends far more time with them than the old populace did with Cotton Mather. What do we see? First of all, we never see anybody working except when they are candidates for medication, aspirin, pain relievers, tranquilizers, cold remedies. At least not office or factory work. The white tornado and the man from Glad will come and help with the housework. The rest of the time, people are at play. Is it possible to sell soft drinks without running into the surf? You only go around once in life, says the beer commercial, so you have to grab everything you can. That character is hanging precariously onto the rigging of his boat because one hand is clutching a beer can. And the airlines, well, there is the bell tolling the end of the Protestant ethic. Fly now, pay later. Pan Am will take you to an island in the sun where you can be a beachcomber. Not a calling approved by Cotton Mather. And Eastern wants to fly you and Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice all to your own little love nest in Jamaica. The message of capitalism has been schizophrenic. At work. Be hard-nosed, industrious, single-minded, frugal and thrifty, and once you leave work, whoopee! Have you seen Carol and Alice in their bikinis? It may be that some doers can step into a telephone booth and emerge as Clark Kent, but I doubt if it works for a whole society. The second literature of exhortation, advertising, sometimes recognizes this, and tries to say that the deferred gratification of the Protestant ethic is a matter of hours, not lifetimes and generations. You've worked hard, you deserve this, says the clever ad. Whether it is a beer, the reward for a day, or a vacation, the reward for a season, or whatever, buy, try, fly. The less intensive attitude toward work also applies to play. In the winter of 1972, Columbia barely managed to field a basketball team for its Ivy League opener. It could send only 6 men to Providence to play Brown. 4 members, the New York Times reported, January 6, had resigned, making it a particularly dramatic example of student unhappiness with organized extracurricular pursuits. Several other college teams have suffered similar player shortages in the last month, said the team's second highest scorer as he departed. My father thinks I'm just a degenerate hippie now, because when I left high school I had all these fantastic ambitions for wealth and fame, and I wanted to be the greatest lawyer in North Carolina. Now I just don't have that. Oppose this to that paragon of the extreme ethic, Vince Lombardi. You could say, of course, that this is not quite fair. Soldiers and professional football players are supposed to win, but the example is not frivolous. When Lombardi died, his death was a major front-page story in all, including the most serious, of newspapers, and personally grieved the President of the United States. Lombardi's hold on the country and the President was that for 10 years the teams he had coached had either won championships or come in second. The ethic, according to Lombardi, all from Lombardi, and run to daylight. Winning is not everything. It is the only thing. The will to excel and the will to win, they endure. They are more important than any event that occasions them. To play this game, you must have that fire in you, and there is nothing that stokes fire like hate. And from Lombardi's players. He had us all feeling that we weren't going to win for the Green Bay Packers, but to preserve our manhood, and we went out and whipped them good and preserved our manhood. Vinny believes in the Spartan life, the total self-sacrifice, and to succeed and reach the pinnacle he has, you've got to be that way. The hours you put in on a job can't even be considered. He treated us all equally, like dogs. I don't think I'd want to be like Lombardi. It takes too much out of you. You drive like that, you've got to give up a lot of time with your family, and you lose a lot physically. Still, now that I'm in business, I'm applying Lombardi's principles. I sent my secretary home crying my first 3 days on the job. One gal retired on me. I was putting them through training camp. I walked in and the first thing I said was, "Your job is on the line. If you don't make it, you're through." I said to the secretary, "What the heck you been doing all day? I don't see anything you've done." And if she gave me a letter and there was one mistake in it, I'd make a big X all the way across it and say, "Type it again." It worked out pretty well. They're organized now. I'm strict. A lot of him has rubbed off on me. And the players on the changes. If you were told to beat your head against the wall, you did it. I think we're entering a different period now. I think we now have to give youngsters a good reason to get them to beat their heads against the wall. Kids today don't fight like we did. They can play football and basketball like hell, but they're very gentle, very kind. They're out playing for fun, and it's not going to interfere with their demonstration for the week or with the things they consider important. Those kids don't look at it like the whole world is going to fall apart if you don't beat the Bears. The examples are so eloquent they need no comment. Someday we may have such technology and science and compound interest that whether people work hard or not would be marginal. But meanwhile there has been a lot of talk about alienation and unhappiness and the blue-collar blues and, for that matter, the white-collar blues. Industry notices this because of absenteeism, turnover, and the lack of candidates for foremen. But at bottom nobody really knows. 5 years ago, from 1970, the National Commission on Technology, Automation, and Economic Progress tried to survey existing knowledge on job satisfaction and dissatisfaction under modern industrial conditions. There was pitifully little. With all the talk about alienation, dehumanization, and the loss of satisfaction from work, you would think that many researchers would be trying to find out the facts, by asking questions and by devising more direct measurements, by trying to figure out What aspects of particular routines are most destructive of satisfaction, and what loss of production would result from changing the routines, but apparently not so. I suspect, pending the reconvening of the National Commission to fill in the gaps, that two things are true in this country. One is that there are certainly a lot of jobs in this country that are boring, not built to the human spirit or the human body, or not fulfilling in some other way, and that most of American industry is only beginning to pay attention to this. The second is that people like to work, as opposed to not working or hanging around the house. They like to work, or at least they like to go to the place where work is, because they see their friends, they have a beer afterward, or a coffee break during, and it gets them into motion. And anyway, we have not developed the tradition of playing the lute and counting that as a good afternoon. Given any degree of pleasantness, encouragement, and satisfaction, they would go to work even without the exhortations of the ethic and the prospect of the shore of eternal blessedness. It is almost axiomatic in the literature of work that part of the problem comes of bending the men to the machines. But computers are machines too. The pay may be less than around the non-electric machinery, yet the blues are not so much heard from this sector, and among the differences may be style, atmosphere, and air conditioning. How hard, or with what care, people work is something else. William H. White, Jr., and the other observers of the 50s told us of the crossover. The executives were working the 70-hour week and taking work home while the blue-collar hours were going down. The difference is that both the executive and the blue-collar worker are now conscious of options that heretofore they did not think they had. Conscious only, for relatively few have acted on the alternative. Behavior and attitude do not necessarily go immediately together. Most of the attention has been paid to the younger generation. At least the future executives were thinking about a balanced life, and the corporations were getting a bit shyer about telling them how demanding corporate life was going to be. Whatever the terrors that haunted the man in the gray flannel suit, not making it, not having the house in the suburb, the terrors do not have quite the same intensity that they used to. The terrors are also less for the industrial workers. For one thing, if you have a house and a car, another house and another car become much less urgent, however pleasant or convenient. There is a lake within cruising range of the Vega plant in industrial Ohio, which is, to put it baldly, a blue-collar lake, which is to say most of the boats belong to union workers from the plants. If they put 5 more boats on that lake, you will not be able to see the water for the boats. Thus, if you are an industrial worker and don't have a boat to take the kids in, the chances are you have a friend who does, or maybe your old man will lend you his. A lack of things, unless those things are food, clothing, and shelter, does not provide terror except for a man in a gray flannel suit who has bought a distortion of the old ethic, its tangible evidences without its spirituality. Back to the Ford memo. Because they are unfamiliar with the harsh economic facts of earlier years, new workers have little regard for the consequences if they take a day or two off. That's about as succinct as one can be. The harsh economic facts of earlier years were an unpleasant but effective motivator. You do not even have to have gone through a Great Depression yourself, if you heard enough talk about it while you were growing up. Now it has been more than 30 years since the end of the Great Depression, and not only did the Prince Valiants in the plant not know about it, they have not even heard that much about it because Granddad does not live with them. I had a series of chats with Daniel Yankovic, social scientist and the head of the leading marketing research and social science research firm that bears his name, a firm that polls continuously in this area for corporate clients. Only in the last 5 years has this change in attitude taken place so strikingly. The changing of work goals, from salary to interpersonal relationships, to content of work, has also been documented by Professor Ray Katzel, chairman of the Psychology Department of New York University, and others. It took that long, almost 2 generations, for the motivation by economic fear to fade. Granted, all the moonlighting to make ends meet at the current levels, granted all the places and pockets that have been missed, and some of the unemployment which persists, mass employment is not a political possibility. Almost everyone would agree to that. And the economic width of grapeshot, what this country needs to shape up these deadheads is a good depression, has gone out of the lexicon of bargaining. What Yankovic calls the sacrifice consensus is breaking down. The sacrifice part of that phrase means that deferrals for something else are not as popular or necessary. I am doing this for my family. I am working so that my son has a better life than I do. And the consensus, obviously, is that there was agreement that this was a right and proper way of life. The breakdown of this sacrifice consensus does not mean that it is replaced right away with something else. Only that now there are many elements present, some sacrificers, some not, but no agreed upon consensus. If women's lib breaks the equation between masculinity and being a good provider, what does that do to motivation? And say to insurance? Yanklevich asked at one point, which started something that made us both late for dinner. So our productivity curve begins to flatten, not only because we are becoming a service economy, but because some of the motivations, the spirit and the fear, have gone out of the producers. And maybe our inflation is persistent. If you want the dank side of the extrapolation, some of the workers retire right there on the job and wait for their pension. Some take Fridays off. The servicing of all our things, and indeed even the services themselves, become so erratic and sloppy that the manufacturers have to work to make them service-free, no checkup for 10,000 miles, and the consumers get so irritated they transfer that irritation into political channels and gladly accept more government regulation of business. So, it is affluence itself that has taken the edge off our edge. But the President need not exhort us to get out and return to the honesty of a day's work for a day's pay, which he has done on several occasions. Nation number 1 will not be unique, because these elements don't stop at the water's edge. At different times, but for the same reasons, they will take place in all the Western industrial countries. The exhortations of Chairman Mao may be to a different end than the shore of blessedness, but the tone is the same. In the capitalist industrial countries, it is the first generation off the farm that provides the longest hours and the most uncomplaining workers. Somebody who has spent 16 hours a day looking at the wrong end of an ox for subsistence on a patch in Poland may not complain at all when he emigrates with a paper suitcase to a steel mill on the south side of Chicago. But his grandson may not think it is that good a deal. We are the furthest off the farm. Japan had a generation that made its industrial reputation. Those Glee Club singers in the Matsushita plant think Matsushita is about the most dazzling thing that ever happened. But meanwhile, the Germans are using Turks and Spaniards, again, fresher from the farm, to fill out the ranks in the Volkswagen plants. All of which does not solve our problem, but gives us company. Perhaps that just gives us a challenge. Adolf Berle, among his other activities, was co-author with Gardner Means of the Granddaddy Classic in all this line of thinking, The Modern Corporation and Private Property. In one of his later books, The American Economic Republic, Berle suggested that we had a flexibility of response which he called the transcendental margin. Those qualities that accounted for the prosperity of Israel but not Iraq, of the Netherlands but not Bulgaria, a certain creative energy. It propelled our system not toward profits, but toward, are you ready? Beauty and truth. In a younger and more optimistic America that did not seem so strange. If we still have it, or something like it, it should be possible to make of work something fulfilling that does not need either the spiritual exhortation or economic fear to motivate it. That is a tall order and a big challenge. But the luckier of our citizens who have experienced something like it know that under those propitious circumstances it can be fun to bust your ass. We ignore revolutions at our peril. Current evidences may or may not lead to profound changes, but we know that even when changes seem to happen quickly, the ideas behind them have been hanging in the air for a long time. Our man at the desk considering how goes the world, had he been in the city of London in 1913, would have been one of the merchant princes of the world. To him for capital came the Moscow Power and Light Company, the breweries of Bohemia, the trolley lines of Shanghai, the apples of Tasmania, the oil of Mexico, the ranches of Texas and Arizona, the tin mines of Malaya, the hemp of Tanganyika, and the railroads of absolutely everywhere. Half a century later, our man was still at his desk and still at work. A bit shabbier, but his role in the world had changed. At this point, the metaphor is going to break down, because revolutions do not come neatly across a desk. If the change is profound enough, the frame through which we have looked at this scene will go away, and the desk and the chair will still be there, but nobody will be sitting at them. but once again, a degree of skepticism is in order. In going through an inordinate amount of the literature, for example, I found one phrase a number of times: "Our youth is in revolt." The writer is a verbal, conceptual person, usually an academic, and what he means is, "My graduate students are in revolt," or "My students have just worked their way through some Marcuse, and they have had it with the system." The Faculty of Engineering is not so prompt to report that the students are in revolt. This is not at all to write off small numbers of people. They may have a symbolic value to everybody else articulating what larger numbers feel. But I think it is important to distinguish the flavor of what has been done. Greenhouse people have reported on greenhouse people, which is to say that academics and book writers have talked about students, who may not end up being greenhouse people, protected from the storms and freezes of life, but who are in a stage of life, being at school, where they are protected from what shapes everybody else. Just the simple numbers have gotten so much bigger. 25 students here and there do not make the impact that a counterculture of 1,000,000 makes. But that million counterculture is possible because of a $1 trillion economy and, among other things, a student population of 8 million. When everybody has to spend 16 hours a day behind an ox, there is no counterculture. Obviously, I would not have taken this time and space if I thought we were still at July 4, 1955, in the Eisenhower Regency. Obviously, in spite of the looseness of the ways in which we have learned, something else is going on. I belong to a club housed in a magnificent old building in New York, which is supposed to be made up of distinguished intellectuals, because I suppose somebody had written The Wealth of Nations as an achievement by my name. The club has been infiltrated by foundation executives and downtown lawyers, and the average age of the members is 94.3. Because foundation executives and downtown lawyers are very long-lived. Anyway, following the precepts of intellectual inquiry, we had a debate one night on Charles Reich's The Greening of America. This is the most talked about of the revolutionary tracts. Corporate America, an idea, incidentally, from the old Burrell and Means classic, has taken over the country, to the mindless end of its own perpetuity. This apparatus of power has become a mindless juggernaut, destroying the environment, obliterating human values, and assuming domination over the mind and lives of its subjects. We are not only an incredibly rich country, but a desperately poor one, because we have disorder, corruption, hypocrisy, war, distorted priorities, an artificiality of work and culture, powerlessness, absence of community, and a loss of self. Apologies for the abruptness of the summary. But out of biological necessity, a new consciousness has emerged out of the wasteland of the corporate state, like flowers pushing up through the concrete pavement. The revolution is individual and cultural, and only changes the political structure as its final act. I did my homework quite properly and intensively, because there was much that was not only naive, but diffusely derivative, some of it funny. 7 times Mr. Reich stated that there was no more chunky peanut butter. The corporate state had the power to deliver only homogenized peanut butter. The corporate state gave us snowmobiles instead of snowshoes, so that the winter forests screech with mechanical noise. Yet 4 times the author celebrated light motorcycles, to restore a sense of free motion, and he obviously never tried to read or think near a quiet road patrolled by a kid with a new Honda. Moby Grape was celebrated for the positive feelings of "It's a beautiful day today," which did seem to me to ignore "Oh, what a beautiful morning." Consciousness 1. And Peggy Lee's "Now it's a good day." Consciousness 2. That was fun and games. My real barbs came for the greenhouse thinking. Yet 5 minutes after the discussion started, I threw my notes away, because there wasn't any debate. My distinguished seniors had read the book, and they were so furious they weren't even listening. Their faces were becoming purple over their white-winged collars. What in the world could be so threatening? On the spot I had to switch sides and become the public defender, because the argument from the other side was, it does not exist. And the point I have been making is that however imperfectly assessed, something else is going on. Jean-François Revel's tract, largely a pamphlet to needle his fellow Frenchmen, says that only in America can the true revolution take place. It is the revolution of our time. It is the only revolution that joins culture, economic and technological power, and a total affirmation of liberty for all in place of archaic prohibitions. It is nice of somebody to say we are still trying, and he mentions some of the political activities that have taken place, sit-ins, civil rights marches, student strikes, and so on. But it is important to separate out, for this discussion, the political aspects. Martha Mitchell may have looked out the window and seen the milling students as the 1970 St. Petersburg mobs, but few others did, and it becomes important to separate out what is style. Long hair may or may not represent something profound, but if you compare yearbook pictures of the class of 1872 and 1972, the beards and the sideburns look much the same. The only difference is that in 1872, Daddy had a beard or mutton chops too. If we leave out politics and style, that brings us back to behavior. Within that, loosely, there is a revolutionary idea, and that is, where did all those bright people get us, anyway? Weren't McGeorge Bundy and Robert McNamara two of the smartest people walking around? Consciousness, too, wrote Reich, rests on the fiction of logic and machinery. What it considers unreal is nature and subjective man. Consciousness 3 is deeply suspicious of logic, rationality, analysis, and of principles. We don't have to look very far for a prime example of the causes of a suspicion of logic, rationality, and objectivity. If we do not stop the communists in Vietnam, they will think we are chicken. They will take over Asia, and so on. We analyze the problem. We will send X numbers of men. We will drop Y numbers of millions of tons of bombs. Every day our television screens will carry the body count report. Them, 5,357. Us, 422. Villages pacified today, 324. The next day the score is the same, and the next. They see the score and we see the score. Therefore we win the war and achieve our principles, and the communists will learn the lesson. It is all there, measured, in what Yankelevich called the McNamara fallacy. The first step is to measure whatever can be easily measured. This is okay as far as it goes. The second step is to disregard that which can't be measured, or give it an arbitrary quantitative value. This is artificial and misleading. The third step is to presume that what can't be measured easily really isn't very important. This is blindness. The fourth step is to say that what can't be easily measured really doesn't exist. This is suicide. Thus, the use of feeling, emotions, ritual, and magic by the unconscious revolutionaries as a rebellion. The marked tendency, says Theodore Roszak, in The Making of a Counterculture, a literary essay which isn't really about that at all, has been to consign whatever is not fully and articulately available in the waking consciousness for empirical or mathematical manipulation to a purely negative catch-all category. In effect, the cultural garbage can, called the unconscious, or the irrational, or the mystical, or the purely subjective. Reich. Accepted patterns of thought must be broken. What is considered rational thought must be opposed by non-rational thought. Drug, thought, mysticism, impulses. Of course, the latter kinds of thought are not really non-rational at all. They merely introduce new elements into the sterile, rigid, outworn rationality that prevails today. That is the real end of the Protestant ethic. Not only everybody stoned, man, but the end of the rationality that led to the burgeoning of capitalism. It is as if Yankelevich wrote, the great victories in succeeding centuries won by Protestantism, individualism, rationalism, science, and industrialization all were gained at a terrible cost, the sacrifice of community. And to define community, he quoted from still another sociologist, Robert Nisbet. Community encompasses all forms of relationships which are characterized by a high degree of personal intimacy, emotional depth, moral commitment, social cohesion, and continuity in time. Community is founded on man conceived in his wholeness rather than in one or another of the roles, taken separately, that he may hold in a social order. Max Weber, one of the founders of sociology, whose phrase gave us the melody for this sonata, and who was the masterful historian of rationalism, wondered whether all the secularization and rationalism would not strip life of its mystery, charm, and meaning. But obviously, and obviously is admittedly a rational adverb. The complex technological society is not going to go away. Some small numbers of people may try to go away from it, to manage on communes with the last whole Earth catalog as a textbook. I wouldn't knock that, and I found myself inordinately tickled to have a book of mine included in the catalog among the kerosene lamps and potter's wheels. The rest of us are left to cope, to try to reintegrate what is missing into what we have. We can use a seeming rational approach to try to assess, for our own rational and managerial ends, what the changes in ethic and spirit mean, but totally to accept a non-rational world is to say goodbye to our role. Anyway, irrationality and mystery and magic are no strangers to us in the money markets. That was one of the points of the money game, to show that while the language of the game was built on rationality and precision, the game itself was played by behavior, and with all sorts of totems and taboos that would do credit to any tribe in New Guinea with an anthropologist in residence. Changes do not occur overnight. The moral code which accompanied the accumulation of capital for the past several hundred years has encouraged us to applaud and honor purposiveness. In his remarkable and extraordinary essay, The Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, Keynes wrote, "Purposiveness means that we are more concerned with the remote future results of our actions than with their own quality or their immediate effects on our own environment. The purposive man is always trying to secure a spurious and delusive immortality for his acts by pushing his interest in them forward into time. He does not love his cat, but his cat's kittens, nor in truth the kittens, but only the kitten's kittens, and so on forward forever to the end of catdom. For him, jam is not jam unless it is a case of jam tomorrow and never jam today. Thus, by pushing his jam always forward into the future, he strives to secure for his act of boiling it an immortality. It may be that the era of purposiveness, with its inherent dictum of sacrifice, is winding down, however slowly. That does not mean another era of something else is immediately at hand. The counterculture may not be a proper guide to the future because it is defined by its opposition. It is easier to describe what it is against than what it is for, but it may serve to stimulate some sort of synthesis, to make us broaden the idea of what is rational, to help crack the consensus. Long before the term counterculture came to be bandied, Keynes had delineated the lopsidedness of the accumulative society. We have been trained too long to strive, he said, and not to enjoy. Perhaps in 100 years, he wrote, 100 years from 1931, that is, the chief problem of mankind would be to live agreeably and wisely and well. What would bring us to that point? Science and compound interest, incremental technology and accruing wealth. Some of the members of our affluent and post-affluent society are already into that spirit, as we have seen. But alas, our views of both science and compound interest are changing. Science is no longer the unmitigated good the late Victorians saw. The radio added to Pasteur, added to the electric light, added to the steam engine. There is even some doubt about how incremental scientific growth is. In The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Thomas Kuhn argues that each generation of scientists rewrites its textbooks to make everything a continuous flow. And as for compound interest, well, Keynes did say, in a phrase usually overlooked, assuming no important wars and no important increase in population, compound interest does not solve our economic problems if population compounds faster, because per capita is our divisor. Unexpected turns in the road do have a way of materializing. It was only a generation ago that some of our industrial societies were worried about how to get the birth rate up. If we could indeed count on the cushion of science and compound interest, then indeed we could look forward to the day when, Keynes again, there will be great changes in the code of morals, all kinds of social customs and economic practices, affecting the distribution of wealth and of economic reward and penalties, which we now maintain at all costs, however distasteful and unjust they may be in themselves, because they are tremendously useful in promoting the accumulation of capital. We shall then be free, at last, to discard. But what do we do on Monday morning? All of these exercises come under the perilous heading of long-term expectations, and we know that the long-term investor must seem, Keynes again, eccentric unconventional, and rash in the eyes of average opinion. If the long-term investor succeeds, that confirms the belief in his rashness, and if he does not, he will not receive very much mercy. Worldly wisdom teaches that it is better for reputation to fail conventionally than to succeed unconventionally. Meanwhile, avarice and usury and precaution must be our gods for a little longer still, for only they can lead us out of the tunnel of economic necessity into daylight. If we are left with capital and not community, we still have to do our best to make our garden grow. Even the enlightened ones said that some hours must be spent in chopping wood and carrying water. But it would be folly not to be aware, even for parochial purposes, of the changes going on around us, and that awareness is not a traditional sensitivity in the rational preciseness of a game played with numbers. Meanwhile, the mechanism and the structure of the markets in which our game is played have survived. The currency and the supercurrency are still there. Maybe some of the players have gotten a little heavier. All of us have to make choices on the uses of our energies. Some things are as they are, and not as they ought to be. But this is the way the world is. If you are still for the game, why may you prosper. I wish you the joys of it. This has been an Audible Inc. production of Super Money, written by Adam Smith, narrated by Adam Zink, executive producer Jennifer Bassick, producer Mike Charzik, and Studio Now Inc. Music by Michael Whalen. Copyright 1972 by Adam Smith, all rights reserved. Forward copyright 2006 by John Wiley & Sons Inc., all rights reserved. Preface copyright 2006 by Adam Smith, all rights reserved. Production copyright 2009 by Audible Inc.
Chapter 14. Telephone and Email Negotiation Tips. The telephone is probably the most treacherous device ever created, at least for negotiations. It's not treacherous if you know how to use it, but most people do not. With cell phones, it's even worse. Disruptions to negotiations are deadly. Even without the telephone, it is all too easy to derail a discussion. Unless, of course, you don't like the way a negotiation is going and want to change the subject for a while. Many years ago, I had a secretary, an Italian woman who was a stunning olive-skinned beauty. Without even trying, she was the most sensual creature I'd ever seen. It wasn't her dress or makeup, nothing like that. It was the way she walked and talked. She radiated beauty and seduction. I was in an intense negotiation with 4 other lawyers. We were really going at it. I would have welcomed a change to the pace in the negotiation, but I didn't know how to do it without creating an incident. I needed a copy of a letter I had received, so I phoned my secretary and asked her to bring that particular document to me. She brought it in, and when she walked into the room, 5 lawyers looked at her and they all stopped talking. That was quite a feat. All she said was, "Here is the document you asked for, Mr. Ross." Then she simply walked out of the room. All 5 lawyers were stunned, and we all looked at each other, and one of them asked, "What were we talking about?" The hostility in the room was instantly diffused, and from there on, the negotiations went smoothly. That unplanned happening was so effective, I made it a permanent part of my negotiating plans and used it many more times when the environment and the personalities warranted it. It never failed to achieve the desired result. It's easy for someone to diffuse a train of thought, to change the atmosphere of a negotiation with a little effort. So you must make a conscious effort to stay focused, especially when distractions occur. It's hard enough to maintain focus in a face-to-face negotiation, but it's even worse when it is a telephone negotiation. It was many years before people were ready to accept telephones into their homes. They couldn't understand why anyone would want to put a device in his living room so that someone could summon him with a bell anytime he wanted and start a conversation. Yet, this is what we have today, and existing technology has created an even more complex negotiating environment. Good and bad aspects of the telephone. The telephone acts as a speed-up device. It's very different from doing business in person. The time frame of a typical phone call versus a typical meeting effectively proves my point. Ask yourself, what would you consider a very long business call? 1 hour would be a very, very long business call. However, if you are negotiating in person, 1 hour is considered a short time to negotiate any meaningful transaction. For example, if you are buying a house, negotiations would take many hours of many days. The very nature of the telephone forces everything to occur in a much shorter time frame than a face-to-face meeting. People are only capable of talking for a limited period and have a tendency to think, "Enough already, let's get it finished." This is a significant disadvantage because both sides end up with less information. Of course, once you know the pitfalls of a telephone negotiation, you can, with practice, use the telephone to your advantage. Convenience. The convenience of the telephone is also its biggest drawback. If you're receiving a call, the timing could be hazardous to your negotiation strategy. If you are unprepared, distracted, or not in a negotiating mood, you can't control the timing of the incoming call. The person making the call immediately interferes with whatever you're doing at that time, the people you're with, and your schedule, and that puts you at an immediate disadvantage. If you believe in the golden rule, doing unto others what they do to you, the opposite works to your advantage. If you are the one making the call, then you are in control, and it's up to the other side to realize the timing is not good and take some defensive action. It's ironic that, as a rule, people don't like to defer a phone call, even when it's inconvenient. It would be so easy to say, "We have a time zone difference, and I'm not awake yet. Can you call me back in an hour?" But many people will say the timing is fine, even when it isn't. They willingly accept the disadvantage because they believe most calls are important. In our culture, we like to get things done quickly. We don't like putting off callers. So once a caller gets someone who's unprepared on the phone, the caller has a distinct advantage. The necessity to answer the telephone has been offset to a degree by caller identification and answering machines, but most people answer the phone when it rings. Some telephone traps. Telephone calls often occur in chaotic situations. When you go into a face-to-face meeting, you will have prepared a thorough outline of goals, a comprehensive list of agenda items, a stack of research kits ready to pass out, and you will have assembled all of the support staff you need to make a compelling argument. Using the telephone, you cannot be as well prepared. The agenda is about the only item that can be adapted to a telephone negotiation. If you're making the call, it's almost a certainty that the other side isn't well prepared. The big question for every telephone negotiation is, how important is the item that one side or both is going to forget? Here are a few suggestions that will give you a huge advantage in any telephone negotiation. Before you make a call, prepare a written agenda for yourself. List in priority the points you want to cover and make sure you cover them all. Whenever someone initiates the call to you, ask him exactly what he wants to talk about, and just listen and make notes of what he is saying. This should be a one-way conversation. He talks and you listen. It's okay to ask for some clarification and to add, "I got it," from time to time, but any meaningful discussion is not started. At the end of the call, you simply say, "You caught me at a bad time right now. I'm in the middle of something, so I'll call you back." You can take 10 minutes, an hour, a day, whatever you need to be able to respond in a well-conceived, intelligent fashion to the items that were raised in the earlier call. Then, when you call back, you're in the driver's seat. Now you know exactly what you plan to say, but the other side is not adequately prepared to respond to your thoughts. Remember, people have a tendency to forget things during telephone meetings. So let the other side ramble on in the normal, informal manner of most telephone discussions and, as I said before, just listen. Someone will, indeed, forget something, and it is most often the person who receives the call and elects to respond without giving careful consideration to the consequences. That receiver is far less likely to be prepared. The person making the call is better prepared, even if it's only an informal mental list of things he wants to discuss. As with all negotiations, the telephone negotiation is going to be dominated by the more organized side. You have to train yourself to always be prepared in any telephone negotiation, and train yourself to be ready for every negotiation, especially the ones you have by telephone. You should have at your fingertips all documents you may need, an agenda of items to be discussed, a calculator, an estimate of the duration of the call, and anything or anyone pertinent to the discussion. Don't forget the words of Louis Pasteur: chance favors the trained mind. There's no face-to-face. One of the biggest flaws in a telephone negotiation is that you can't react to anything but the other person's voice. You don't see any facial expressions, any body language, or interplay with others on the call, or any of the many forms of input we might ordinarily use to judge the effect of our message on others, or to gauge the conviction the other side has for the arguments they make. If you want to get a no, use the telephone. It's the worst forum for making a convincing argument and for changing someone's mind. The reactions of other people are invisible to you, so it's much easier for anyone to play power games with you without you even being aware of it. For example, if you're in a conference call and you make a statement, one person on the other side can convey thoughts to the other person with a facial expression or gesture that you will never see. That won't work in a live face-to-face negotiation. The lack of input in a live and in-person discussion is a huge handicap, especially if you are alone and there are two or more people on the other end of the line. You never know who is listening. The telephone negotiation presents a special type of challenge. You never really know who is on the other end and what their roles are. The other side might not tell you the truth even if you ask. They might say, "It's just me on the line today." And you might answer, "Good, I'm glad John Smith isn't listening, because I can't talk to that SOB since he only creates problems but never comes up with a solution." And, of course, John Smith is on the phone, and now he's a worse enemy than he was before. If you were in a room face-to-face, you can see who is there. Or the other side might tell you, "Just between you and me, my accounting people don't like your numbers." You can defend your numbers easily enough, and you might even be inclined to say something derogatory about accountants in general. But the CFO or some other accountant may also be on the phone. They may be scribbling notes to the person you're talking to, telling him what to say, what to ask, and how to answer. This puts you at a tremendous disadvantage, because you don't realize who's there and who is controlling the negotiation. You have to play defense on the telephone. Assume someone else is listening in to your conversation and that you have to be careful about what you say. If you believe that you suffer any disadvantage in a telephone discussion, insist on a face-to-face meeting. This disadvantage can be applied in reverse, of course. If you're going to have a telephone negotiation with someone, you might be wise to have your accountant or lawyer, president, or other advisor there scribbling notes to you, telling you what to say. If there is going to be an advantage and a disadvantage, you're better off having the former than suffering from the latter. Interruptions are deadly. Negotiations always have a certain momentum at a particular time. Every interruption to the normal flow is a setback. No person can maintain his focus or posture while interruptions are occurring. If you are interrupted, your mind goes elsewhere, and your train of thought is destroyed. And the more interruptions there are, the worse this becomes. So if you're on the telephone with someone, and he keeps excusing himself to talk to someone else who came into the room or called on another line, you have to nip it in the bud. You need to say, "Call me at a time when you can talk without interruptions. How's 3 p.m. today? Block out 45 minutes and call me then." Ironically, when you're on the telephone, you might have the habit of accepting the kinds of interruptions that would be entirely unacceptable if you were in a live meeting. Someone else in your office would never think of disrupting a meeting by walking into the room and asking you a question. But he can telephone you, and if you take the call, they have achieved the same result. Sometimes interruptions occur that must take precedence over any telephone negotiation. For example, if Donald Trump walks into my office while I'm in the middle of a telephone call, there's no way I can concentrate on that call while Donald's waiting. I immediately tell the listener, "Something came up that requires my immediate attention, so I'll have to call you back." Notice, I didn't say when I would call. So the timing is all mine if Donald's visit requires some immediate action. You can't examine documents. If you're in a face-to-face negotiation, you can make the argument, "I've got figures right here that justify my position." You can present the proof to the other person as you're talking. You can't do that on the telephone. Have you ever been on the phone and heard the other person rustling papers? He's looking for the document that justifies his position, but what good is it? All you hear is the rustling of paper. You can't see it. Just as you can't read the other person, you also can't read the other side's documents, and they can't read yours. Both sides are at a disadvantage in this situation. One side can't refute the other side's points because they don't see the other side's documents. You really don't even know if they have any compelling evidence. It could be a negotiating ploy when, on the telephone, to claim to have compelling evidence, knowing the other side can't demand to see it right then and there. So, the other person tells you during a real estate negotiation, "I have a survey by a reputable brokerage firm showing that the average rent for a building such as yours is only $28 per square foot. You're asking for $35. How do you refute the other side's survey when you're negotiating on the phone? The survey might not exist. It might be 5 years old. It might have been the result of poor sampling. You have no way of knowing that if you can't examine the document. There is a tendency to expect resolution. This is a trap that is indigenous to a telephone negotiation. Somehow, on a telephone call, people expect some type of agreement to result. That doesn't always happen in a face-to-face meeting. In a face-to-face negotiation, you may come to the point where you want to say, "Let me think about this for a couple of days, and then we can get back together." That's not unusual when you're there with the other person. But on the telephone, both parties are prone to settle something one way or the other. If we talk about some issue for 15 or 20 minutes, we both think we have the right to get a definitive answer then and there. Learning to master the telephone. Now that we've given some thought to the intricacies of telephone negotiations, I'm going to show you how to become a master at turning telephone negotiations in your favor. Learn to listen. People don't listen intently on the phone. That's the main thing for you to remember. The basic reason for slipshod listening is that you don't know when something important is coming, only after it has been said. At the same time, you don't really know if the other party is really listening to you, so the problem is twofold. Without any visual cues, you're only responding to what you hear. So you need to put extra effort into really listening intently to what the other side is saying and making notes to remember some key items. If you want to drive somebody crazy in a telephone negotiation, don't say anything for a few minutes. Before long, the other side will get frantic and say, "Are you still there? Did we get disconnected? Can you hear me all right?" Or something akin to that. In a face-to-face meeting, there are numerous situations where either one or both sides are silent, maybe just contemplating an answer. On the telephone, the lack of talking indicates a complete breakdown of communication, so the last speaker feels compelled to fill the void. When you let this happen, the other side is compelled to do the talking, and you will learn a lot more about them than they can learn from your silence. In some situations, this will result in the other side giving you much more than they ever would if you were in a room with them. Ask the purpose of the call. Anytime someone calls you, always ask what his agenda is, why he is calling. Then just listen carefully to his response and talk only when there is more information you can obtain by your response. If he says, "I think the price you're asking is too high," you may respond by asking, "What do you think is the right price?" You're getting more information, but you haven't agreed that the price is too high, and you haven't even indicated that you're willing to negotiate. But if he gives you an alternative price, at least you know what his thinking is. You have gained information while giving none in response. After getting all of the information you can, you still want to be in control of the agenda. So you should say, "Let me consider what you've said, and I'll get back to you." If it's to your advantage, you can set a time for you to continue the discussion. Otherwise, just leave the time open. Meanwhile, you can take whatever action you think is appropriate to tailor a response. Then, when you call him back, you are prepared and have supporting information to bolster your position. You already know how much he said he is willing to pay. You also know at what price you would be willing to sell. If the range of uncertainty is narrow, it should be relatively easy to bridge the gap. Maybe "let's split the difference" might be the way to go, or some other appeal to human nature that we discussed earlier. If the gap is wide, you will need to present some compelling reasons for the other side to revise their numbers, or prepare to abort with a take-it-or-leave-it stance. Always use a checklist or agenda. You should get in the habit of creating and updating a telephone checklist or phone call agenda that lists items in priority order to ensure that you won't leave anything out. You want to be sure to gather as much information as possible if the other side initiates the call, so that when you call them back, you are prepared for everything. So, when you're done discussing price and you know what number they have in mind, you can ask, "What else do you want to talk about?" Maybe delivery dates, representations, or other issues will be raised. When you call back, you have your checklist and agenda and the arguments you will use with whatever backup you need. Then you will be as organized and prepared as you can possibly be. Don't hold telephone negotiations where interruptions may occur. You want to be sure you won't be interrupted during an important telephone negotiation. You should close your door and alert a receptionist or secretary not to put through any calls until you say so. You can control this on your side, but you won't be able to control the same thing for the other side unless you insist on it as a condition for your call. You can say, "We have a lot to discuss, and we should do it without interruptions. I can clear an hour at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Is that okay with you?" Pick a time that works for both parties, and you'll be surprised how much will be accomplished. One excellent way to avoid interruptions is to create what I call a quiet hour. Set aside an hour in which you will make all the calls you need to make, but will not permit any outside interruptions, i.e., personal visits, deliveries, or incoming calls. I have found that my quiet hour is the equivalent of at least 80 minutes. Try it for yourself, and you'll be amazed at how much you can do in that hour. Have all materials available when on the phone. If there is a lot of documentation involved with your negotiation, the telephone is the worst venue to use. But if you have to talk on the phone, be well organized and have everything ready. Have all of your documents easily accessible and well organized to make your arguments. You would never talk into a face-to-face meeting without organizing your materials. Many people are so casual about telephone negotiations that they are ill-prepared to negotiate intelligently. Knowing this puts you in control. If you organize well and prepare everything, you will have a clear advantage. It's not just your materials that should be well prepared, You should be sure you have anticipated all that you may need. For example, be prepared to crunch numbers if necessary. Most negotiations involve money and a discussion of it, so you have to be ready to do some on-the-spot number crunching. If numbers may be involved, be sure you have a calculator handy and you or someone on your side knows how to operate it. Take good notes. You might be a great note-taker in face-to-face meetings, but in a telephone negotiation, I cannot stress enough the importance of good note-taking. You must take good notes about all phases of the discussion, what was decided, areas of continuing disagreement, definition of the issues, and itemization of new issues. To be of any value to you, your notes must be immediately filed when the call is over. If you wait and the notes get lost or misplaced, you would be better off if the telephone call never took place. Most negotiations consist of a series of discussions and meetings, so your notes should be dated, list the name of person or persons on the other side, and they should be detailed. You should assume you will need to refer to them again later, and if you are sloppy, you will pay the price for it. Most people don't take the kind of notes I'm referring to. If you have ever watched someone while they're on the phone, they might be having an intense negotiation, talking about important issues, but not taking a single note, and maybe even doodling. That telephone negotiation counts as much as a face-to-face meeting, but without notes, it is much more difficult to pin down the other side. If the other side doesn't recall the details of a discussion, it is powerful to be able to tell them the time and date of the conversation and read back what they said. If they don't have good notes, you'll win that argument hands down. Confirm the conversation with a follow-up letter. I've talked previously about documenting your meetings with a periodic follow-up letter summarizing the issues, what was decided, what remains, deadlines, and so on. But this is even more important after a telephone negotiation, because people are so casual about telephone conversations, they have a tendency to forget what was said. They are prone to forget the details of their agreements, and they have a tendency to take the telephone negotiation less seriously. Documenting the details of a telephone negotiation is more critical than it is with a face-to-face meeting. People will very rarely respond to the letter by saying, "That's not what we agreed on," or "That's not what we discussed." They either don't read your letter or email, or they don't think the issues you stated are important enough to take issue with immediately. Here again, people underestimate the importance of a telephone negotiation, so they are not likely to challenge anything you say in a follow-up letter. The follow-up letter or email becomes a very important document later if the other side contradicts or conveniently forgets something they agreed to in a previous telephone negotiation. Email rules of thumb. Unlike the telephone, email communication leaves a paper trail, so the odds are better that everyone will at least take seriously what they write down. Some important things to remember about email. Grammar and punctuation make impressions. There is a tendency for people to not check spelling in email, but they should. Spelling and punctuation are not just old-fashioned ideas. They create an impression about your education and intelligence and your attention to detail. They also convey the idea that you care about the impression you make on other people. Nonverbal expressions can be misinterpreted, so be careful. When you have only the words to read, you can't hear the tone of voice. So if I write to you, it's important that we discuss this immediately. You can't tell whether I'm in a friendly mood or angry with you. You don't know if I'm being casual or demanding. So I have to be careful how I construct my message. For example, I might write to you, "As you and I have already discussed, the document has to be recorded by tomorrow to meet our contractual deadline. It's important that we discuss this immediately." Now, with an explanation preceding my previous statement, it makes more sense. I'm providing an explanation so you will respond more readily. I received an email from a woman not long ago. We'd been exchanging emails and working out some details to a deal. All that the message said was, "No thank you." The lack of tone can be easily misunderstood, or even be thought to mean something completely unintended. This concerned me because things had been going along quite well, so I was puzzled and, frankly, I couldn't remember exactly what I'd said in my last email. So I looked it up. She had sent me several things I had requested, and I'd sent a reply that simply said, "I received your information. Thank you." Now her email made sense. She had meant to answer my thank you message by saying, "No, thank you," i.e., she was thanking me for something I had done for her earlier. But her tone of gratitude didn't come through. That, combined with a lack of grammar and emphasis, could have led to a misunderstanding. Follow-up is important and courteous. Following up after a complicated discussion is an effective negotiating tool and a courtesy. Whether your meeting took place in person, by telephone, or by email, a summary is always a smart idea. You can start out by saying, "Thank you for all of your hard work in resolving the details. I'm sure we will be able to arrive at a solution to the remaining issues." You then summarize what you've agreed on, what else needs to be done, and what deadlines, if any, have been set. This maintains clarity and perspective during the negotiation. It also keeps communication open and avoids misunderstandings. Email is an easy method because it doesn't take up any office space. The other side can move your email to an online folder without needing physical file space and retrieve it easily later on. As long as you are keenly aware of the problems in telephone and email communication, you should be able to manage problems as they arise, and manage them so that they do not handicap you during your negotiations. Being aware of the pitfalls makes you a better negotiator. Notice that I never used the words telephone conversation in this entire chapter, but rather telephone negotiation. Every telephone call or telephone conversation, no matter how casual, is in fact a negotiation, and you should give it as much importance as any other type of negotiation. Don't forget it. Chapter 15. When to use non-binding letters of intent, or memoranda of understanding. A binding commitment you might obtain from other people is not limited to a signature on a contract. Every negotiation, especially a Trump-style negotiation, is based on developing a personal relationship with other people and deriving the benefits that grow from it. These include something beyond the legalities of a contract. A moral commitment from a person who is trustworthy is often better and stronger than a legal one. I can personally attest that this trait runs in the Trump family. When Donald Trump was working on Trump Tower, he needed access to Walter Hoving, the CEO of Tiffany & Company. He wanted to negotiate for the purchase of Tiffany's excess air rights at their Fifth Avenue location and a purchase of their option on the Candell property next to Trump Tower. Donald's father and Walter Hoving had done some business together, and Donald's father suggested to Donald that he could work out a fair deal with Hoving in a short period of time. A meeting was set up in Hoving's office with Hoving, a young attorney from Coudert Brothers who was counsel to Tiffany, Fred Trump, and me. There had been prior discussions between Fred Trump and Walter Hoving that were to be finalized at that meeting. Fred and Walter shook hands on the deal, and we were about to leave when the attorney from Coudert said he had prepared a document for Fred Trump to sign. Hoving asked to see the document, looked it over, and proceeded to tear it up. Looking at his attorney, Hoving said, "Young man, you may be a good lawyer, but you have a lot to learn about dealing with people. When Fred Trump makes a deal, his word is good enough, and there's no need for a written document." This doesn't mean you can do away with documents. In a complex negotiation, the working documents you prepare can serve to define the issues and bring the entire transaction into focus and create that all-important moral commitment for which Trump-style negotiating is known. Good working documents add to the time investment by both parties, which helps build commitment to the deal. and they help to save time and disagreements later by serving as an outline for those final legal documents. Trump's World Tower at the United Nations is a perfect example of the way good documents in a negotiation can support key verbal agreements. Building this project was not a simple matter of buying the land and getting permits. Trump wanted to build the tallest residential structure in New York, and to do this, he needed to acquire air rights, which allow a developer to build a taller building than he otherwise could. Under New York laws, you are allowed to transfer air rights from one property to another on the same block. So, to develop a very tall building, Trump needed to buy air rights from adjoining landowners. This was complicated because he had to negotiate with many people at the same time and keep it all confidential as well. If word of what he was trying to do became public, the price of the air rights would have immediately skyrocketed. He proceeded to make verbal deals with all the owners in which he promised them the highest price he offered to any of them. Their reliance on his word enabled him to make deals with everyone before word spread about his intentions. As you might imagine, all of these arrangements, promises, contracts, and purchases of rights involved a lot of written documents, even before the deal got to its stage of execution of legal and binding documentation. But the verbal agreement was never violated. The value of a non-binding letter of intent, or memorandum of understanding. To bring a transaction into focus, especially a complex one, you must begin with a thorough and clear definition phase to crystallize the thinking of the parties. This is where a letter of intent, LOI, or a memorandum of understanding, MOU, can be very helpful. The deal can initially be discussed in general terms, but to clarify the understanding of all parties, you may need to prepare and distribute a piece of paper with the whole deal summarized. There is little practical difference between an LOI and an MOU, both of which should be non-binding to achieve the desired result. A review without involving lawyers. The LOI is usually used to outline a transaction before too much discussion has occurred. The MOU is typically utilized after the parties have met and agreed on several items. The purpose of an LOI or MOU are identical, so don't sweat the label. Each LOI or MOU should be very brief, a page or two at most, with very concise language. It summarizes the intentions of both sides. The LOI or MOU should specifically state that it is not a legal document, that when signed is binding on either party. In light of this, it shouldn't read like it was prepared by a lawyer. It should be more informal in tone and much shorter and less detailed than the actual contract that is prepared later by your legal counsel. It should hit the highlights of the deal in general terms with a minimal amount of specificity. It's like an artist's sketch on canvas outlining the picture before he begins applying paint. He sketches in the outline of what he's going to paint and what it will look like, but the actual details are to be added later. The LOI or MOU engenders better thinking. In the course of preparing an LOI or MOU, you not only focus on what you have agreed on, but also on what has not yet been agreed on. Since it can double as a type of interim negotiation status report, the LOI or MOU can do much to bring both parties to the same level of understanding, even though there has not been a complete meeting of the minds. For example, let's say you write in the LOI or MOU that the purchase price for the property is $500,000, but many aspects of the deal have yet to be clarified. When is it to be paid? How much of a down payment is required? Are there any contingencies? The purchase price is just a starting point. The LOI or MOU stimulates thought on both sides as to what has been negotiated and what remains to be negotiated. Highlights terms that were not negotiated. It is often just as important to clarify terms that might not have been raised or fully discussed. These might not be obvious to both sides, or one side might have an entirely different take on the agreement than the other side. As you go through your preparation of an LOI or MOU, Details arise that you realize weren't discussed. Once you recognize that fact, you prepare a list of the issues not yet discussed and create a new agenda for their negotiation. Fills the gaps in continuity. In most negotiations, differences arise between the two sides because there is a break in the continuity of the negotiation. As long as both sides continue talking, they can resolve the areas where different positions have surfaced. The longer the time gap between negotiating sessions, the greater the likelihood that memories will get hazy. So when a negotiation stops, the LOI or MOU serves as a bridge to indicate what has been agreed on or not agreed on as of its date. Negotiation often consists of hundreds of smaller negotiations. I call this the theory of transactional fractionalization. The negotiation is actually a series of individual negotiations that take place at different times, under different circumstances, and with different parties involved. Ultimately, all of these individual negotiations are blended into the final completion of the deal. Because there is usually some kind of time lapse involved between start and finish, this multitude of smaller negotiations can cause problems because both sides are likely to forget exactly what was discussed, when it was discussed, and if a final resolution has been reached. An LOI or MOU summarizes the multitude of smaller agreements that both sides have reached and shows the amount of progress the parties have made toward a final settlement. If you have excellent notes or a playbook, it will be an easy task for you to summarize the state of negotiations at any time. Who controls the document? Whenever you draw up an LOI or an MOU, recognize the power you gain by putting your thoughts down on paper. It defines the agreement. It provides a chance for the other side to agree or to disagree. And in the absence of a response, your tacit agreement on its contents will make it easier to finish the deal. Two aspects of an LOI or MOU are worth noting. 1. Document control is important. Whenever you have the chance to draw up documents, you should take it. This refers to contracts, amendments, leases, and of course any LOIs or MOUs. The person preparing the document decides what goes in, what gets emphasized, and what gets left out. You know what you want to draw attention to, and you also know what you choose to leave out because of its controversial nature. The other side will read what you put in the LOI or MOU, but they will have to figure out for themselves what you left out. Not only is it true that most people are poor note keepers and fail to follow up communications in a timely manner, they are often blinded by your written words and conclude that you have accurately summarized the whole deal. 2. The LOI or MOU may reveal the hidden negotiators. You sometimes get the sense in a negotiation that the person you're talking to is operating under a set of restrictive guidelines and doesn't actually make the final decisions. When you send out a non-binding LOI or MOU and request a signature indicating approval, pay attention to who signs or initials it when it comes back. The person signing the LOI or MOU may be the actual decision maker. If it is initialed by the other side's attorney or legal department, then you know it went through a legal review. If the CFO signs off, then it was scrutinized from a financial point of view. If someone else, who you never met, signs the LOI or MOU, like the CEO of the company, you know that he or she is the real power behind the negotiation on the other side. Getting approval of your LOI or MOU is a powerful, important step. You need to know who has to agree on the LOI or MOU. Understanding the scope and knowing the people participating in the approval process makes it hard for anyone on the other side who has signed off on the document to raise new issues at a later date. A guide for the legal documents. The structure of an LOI or MOU should be viewed as a preliminary draft of what will ultimately become a legal agreement. That way, an attorney can't simply go off and make up a contract without making it conform to the agreements as defined and described in the LOI or MOU. It prevents someone from making last-minute changes to items that have been agreed on. While a legal contract can certainly embellish on the terms set forth in the LOI or MOU, it cannot change the contents or what the other side agreed to, either explicitly or implicitly. Creates a moral commitment and adds to time invested. Some aspects of every negotiation are intangible. The LOI or MOU helps clarify and define these important but intangible issues for both sides. As you draft the LOI or MOU, you may discover that these issues are clarified in your mind simply as a part of the process of articulating your point of view. Just because something is intangible doesn't mean it is not important. Moral commitment is sometimes more important than legal commitment. Very often, an LOI or MOU, even though both expressly state that they are non-binding, may actually create a moral commitment that both sides feel obligated to honor. It may be an agreement to negotiate in good faith, for example. The agreement may even be unspoken. The LOI or MOU may transform an intangible into a tangible. If the other side agrees with what you write in your LOI or MOU and feels morally committed, he will be reluctant to come back later and contradict that agreement. The act of seeing the LOI or MOU and acknowledging its acceptance is powerful. For someone to disagree, he has to take specific steps to discuss the disagreement by communicating with you. If he doesn't communicate with you, then you have a moral commitment from him that is only good to the extent of his morality. I tell people that this is often more valuable than a legal commitment. This is even more binding if approval is obtained from a key executive or board of directors. The LOI or MOU is also valuable because it gets you beyond the phase where one side is asking, should we make a deal or not? Once you define the essence of the deal in the LOI or MOU, it articulates the deal in a way you believe the agreement exists. That makes it easier for the other side to agree, since the LOI or MOU serves as a map of the deal. Time investment is important to negotiators. The time investment, the importance of time put into the negotiation, is important to both sides, and the negotiation itself gains value. The LOI or MOU are yet another step adding to the time investment. If you prepare the LOI or MOU, that takes up your time. When the other side receives it, they spend time reading it and discussing the deal. There may be more time spent if they want to modify the LOI or MOU and send it back to you. And then you also spend more time reviewing it. So both sides increase their invested time, and that motivates them to make the deal succeed. Chapter 16. The most intricate deal I ever negotiated. Occasionally, you may come across a transaction where a participant refuses to negotiate because he feels that his position is so strong he can control the outcome just by playing hardball. Or a key player may be absent, making a transaction very difficult to complete. But it can be done. It just takes a little extra tenacity and creativity. I remember a deal just like that with the Katz Agency. Although it was not a Trump deal, it had all the earmarks of a Trump-style negotiation. As I go through the scenario, I will identify factors, terms, and techniques, in parentheses, that have been discussed in this book, so you can see how these things played out in a complex, high-stakes negotiation. Since the transaction was so dramatic, I have written it like a play, in 3 acts. Act 1. Background. All of the action takes place in New York City in 1990. A major recession has been in progress, and companies have shelved any expansion plans they had. Many prominent builders recently built buildings on speculation, without any commitments from tenants, believing that the rental market would recover by the time their buildings were completed. That didn't happen, and as a result, there was an overabundance of vacant space with no takers. At that time, the Katz Agency, now the Katz Media Corporation, which was a titan in the sale of radio and TV time to advertisers, was contemplating a merger that would substantially increase its space needs by at least 50,000 square feet. Katz was headquartered in 150,000 square feet of space at One Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza on 2nd Avenue, in a 750,000 square foot building between 47th and 48th Streets. This sounds like a lot of technical detail, but you'll see why it's important to the story in a minute. About half of the Katz Agency space was covered by one lease. I'll call it the good lease. The rest of the space had been leased at various times as the need arose and was subject to several separate leases, the bad leases. The good lease covered about 75,000 square feet of space and had a remaining term of approximately 3 years. The rent for the good lease space was $25 per square foot, which was cheap by the standard of the time. My task was to renegotiate the good lease and the bad leases and get Katz the additional space it needed for the merger, while also taking advantage of the depressed real estate market. Cast of characters: George H. Ross, Ross, a consultant for the Edward S. Gordon Company, ESG, a reputable real estate brokerage firm in New York. Ross is an experienced negotiator and real estate attorney who was hired as the chief negotiator for Katz. Larry Rubin, Rubin, Katz's current landlord, a respected and smart real estate developer who owned One Dag Plaza. Ross and Rubin had done many deals in the past and had mutual respect for one another, a relationship. Ross knew that Rubin was a tough negotiator who would exercise as much power as he had. This was actual knowledge proven by experience, not apparent knowledge. Rubin believed that Ross knew the business of real estate and had a reputation as a deal maker, not a deal breaker. Actual knowledge. Jim Greenwald, Greenwald, the head honcho of the Katz Agency and a close friend of Ross, relationship, as well as an investor in Beck Ross Communications Corporation, a Ross-owned entity that owned and operated several radio stations. Harry Macklowe, Macklowe, a respected, smart developer who in 1988 had built a major office building at 125 West 55th Street in New York City. The building was completed more than a year before this negotiation, but was still completely vacant. So Macklowe was in trouble. Ross and Macklowe had done deals in the past, had an amicable working relationship, building trust, and they knew they were both deal makers. Actual knowledge. Scene 1. Place. After reviewing and analyzing the good lease and the bad leases, obtaining critical information necessary to formulate a strategy, Ross meets Greenwald for lunch, creating a friendly environment. Ross: Jim, tell me exactly what you would like me to accomplish for you. Finding the story. Jim: George, I'm in serious negotiations to complete a merger for $20 million that will strengthen Katz's position in the market. I have some lousy leases at One Dag that are all over the place regarding expiration dates and rents. I would like to consolidate my entire operation and make a new deal with Rubin that will handle my expanded space needs and get me a rent I can afford. Can you help me? Ross: Sure, Jim. I know Rubin well, so I'll arrange a meeting with him to test the waters, and I'll tell you what happens. Ross goes back to his office and prepares for his meeting with Rubin using the post technique described in Chapter 9 for the initial negotiation. P equals persons. Rubin and Ross will meet at Rubin's office. Rubin will probably have his son there to hear what Ross has to say. O equals objective. To see if Rubin is amenable to recasting the good lease and the bad leases and leasing more space to Katz. S equals strategy. To try to convince Rubin that this approach eliminates the uncertainty of the rental market in 3 years when the good lease expires, and affords him the benefit of Katz occupying more space. T equals tactics. Tell Reuben about the distinct possibility of Katz vacating Reuben's building entirely and making a deal for space in a new vacant building on Manhattan's West Side, creating a bogey. Ross prepares a checklist of items to be discussed at the meeting. 1. Does Reuben have an additional 50,000 square feet available to lease to Katz? 2. Is Reuben happy with Katz as a tenant? 3. How amenable is Reuben to recasting the Katz leases? Scene 2. Place: Reuben's office sometime later. Ross, Larry Reuben, and Reuben's son are present. Ross: Larry, I've been engaged by Katz to solve their space problems in your building. They would like to take more space. Right now, only one of their leases is at a rent consistent with today's weak market. Reuben: George, Katz is a good tenant. They pay their rent on time, and I would be interested in making a new lease for more space and renegotiating the good lease, but I won't touch the bad leases. I like the high rents and the staggered expirations. That's my position. Take it or leave it. You know that if I want to, I can beat any deal you make elsewhere, so it's best to deal with me. Ross: Then I'll have to make a deal on a new vacant building on the West Side where the owners are dying for a tenant like Katz, and see if you can beat that, creating a bogey. Reuben: Come on, George. We both know that the rents on those new buildings have to be high to satisfy the mortgagees. You also know that Katz's remaining obligation on the leases in my building is several $1 million. No builder in his right mind will take over that obligation. Katz's only hope is to make a deal with me. No one can make a better deal than I can. Plus, Katz will save the cost of moving, creating a new installation, and an untold amount of aggravation. I hold all the cards. Intimidation. Come back to me with a reasonable proposal, and I'll consider it. Scene 3. Place: Jim Greenwald's office. Ross and Greenwald are present. Ross: Jim, I met with Reuben, and any deal with him will be tough to swallow, because he knows that if he wants to, he can beat any deal you make elsewhere. I've examined your leases, and you've got real troubles with the high rents and long terms on a lot of your space. Greenwald: What can we do? Ross: I've got an idea. Harry Maclaw has a new vacant building on 55th Street and might be willing to make a deal with Katz. I'm very friendly with Maclaw. I'd like to come up with an alternate deal to induce Reuben to back down. Always have a plan B. Greenwald: Okay, see what you can do. Scene 4. Place: Ross's office, where he prepares a checklist for his upcoming meeting with Maclaw. It looks like this. Questions needing answers. 1. Does Maclaw's building have at least 200,000 square feet of vacant space in 125 West 55th Street? Assume yes, but ask Maclaw. 2. What rent is Maclaw asking for his vacant space? What concessions are available, such as free rent and money for tenant improvements? What lease term is available? Options available. Ask Maclaw, but check ESG's database. Assume accuracy of information the other side gives you, but always verify it. Who holds the mortgage on Maclaw's building? Is there a hidden negotiator? What is Maclaw's financial condition? Assume it's good, but verify. Post plans for Maclaw meeting. P equals persons: Ross, Maclaw, and members of Maclaw's staff. Get name and function. O equals objective. See if Maclaw has space to meet Katz's needs, and if so, on what terms is he willing to make a deal? Creating the zone of uncertainty. Staking out the starting negotiating positions of the two sides. S equals strategy. Tell Maclaw that Katz is very strong financially and would be a great tenant to have in his building. Tell him that Katz has given me the authority to make a quick deal. T equals tactics. Bring a history of CATS. Started in 1886 as the first advertising representative. Now #1 in New York. Have the financials of CATS available if necessary to verify net worth. Ross calls Macklowe and arranges a meeting. Act 2, Scene 1. Place, Macklowe's office. Present are Macklowe, Ross, and Macklowe's CFO. Ross: Hi, Harry. It's good to see you again. Creating a friendly atmosphere. I'm here to bring you a first-rate tenant for 125 West 55th Street. Have you got 175,000 square feet of vacant space? Macklowe: Have I got 175,000 square feet? Hell, I've got a whole 550,000 square foot building vacant. What do you have in mind? Ross: I represent the CATS agency, which has 150,000 square feet at One Dog. They have a bunch of leases, but I could convince them to move to 125 West 55th Street if I can get them a good deal. What are you asking in rent? How much free rent do you give? What's the value of the initial improvements you make for tenants? Macklowe: My asking rent starts at $34 per square foot for lower floors and goes up for higher floors. I want $5 increases every 5 years. I'm looking for a minimum 10-year lease. I'll give a 4-month free rent concession, and I have a $30 per square foot work letter for tenant improvements. Ross has now established one parameter of the zone of uncertainty. But if you bring me the right tenant, we'll work things out. Voluntary useful admission. Ross: Okay, Harry, I hear you. Let me crunch some numbers, and I'll get back to you. Ross goes back to his office to have his accounting department, using professionals, compute the estimated cost to CATS of the proposed Macklowe deal. Since Ross now has the parameters of Plan B, he sets up a new meeting with Reuben. Scene 2. Place, Reuben's office. Present are Reuben, Reuben's son, and Ross. Ross: Larry, I've been thinking over what you said, and I agree that no one can make a better deal for the CATS agency than you, if you are willing to do so. They need a 10-year lease for 175,000 feet. What deal are you willing to make? Reuben: Here's what I'll do. I want them to increase the rent on the 75,000 square feet of cheap space to $36 per square foot, starting immediately. On the rest of the space, I want $42 per square foot, starting immediately. I want a bump of $4 per square foot every 5 years. I won't pay for any improvements to the space, and there's no rent concession. Ross has now established the other parameter of the zone of uncertainty. Go back and tell CATS that's my offer. Ross: I'll discuss it with CATS and get back to you. Ross goes back to his office to compare the Reuben proposal versus the Macklowe proposal. Scene 3. Place, Ross's office. Ross and John Williams, a number cruncher at ESG, are present. Ross: John, I ask you to run the numbers on Plan A, the Reuben deal, and Plan B, the Macklowe deal. Did you do that? John: Yes. Here is the comparison. Ross: So the total cost of the Macklowe deal is $4,855,000 less than Reuben's offer if we eliminate the loss on the subletting of the existing space. Is that right? John: Yes. Also, I've assumed that CATS's share of any increases in taxes and operating expenses would be the same for both buildings. Ross: Thanks, John. I'll relay this information to the CATS agency. Ross sets up meeting with Greenwald. Scene 4. Place, Greenwald's office at the CATS agency. Present are Ross, Greenwald, and CATS's CFO, Jones. Ross: We've run the preliminary numbers on both deals, and while they look almost equal, a few things worry me. If we go the Macklowe route, the cost of your exposure on the Reuben space could be as much as $4 million. Your leases require you to pay that much in rents, whether you are in the building or not. Also, I'm not sure of how much money Katz will have to pay for improvements in the Macklowe building, beyond what Macklowe has provided. It could be a sizable expense. Since you shouldn't pay rent for both spaces at the same time, I'll have to get assurances that Macklowe can cover the remaining rent you owe at One Dog Plaza. Finally, I'm sure any deal will require his mortgage holder's approval, and I haven't started the hard bargaining yet, so I'm not sure they'll okay the final deal I intend to make. I'd like your professionals to satisfy themselves on my estimates of all the cost involved. Greenwald. Jones, please take care of that. Ross to Greenwald. There are some intangibles for you to consider if you go the Macklowe route. You can't put a dollar value on them, but they should play a role in your final decision. Each floor in Macklowe's building is 30,000 square feet, while the floors in Rubin's building are only 17,000 square feet. The larger floor plate means less traffic between floors and a more efficient operation. You'll need fewer copiers, fax machines, food pantries, and receptionists. These will substantially reduce operating cost. The location of the Macklowe building is better than Rubin's. It is more centrally located, close to transportation systems, and more prestigious. You can design a new space to suit your needs instead of trying to update space that is 15 years old. In making a long-term deal, price should not be your only consideration. There's no right price for the wrong item. Think it over and let me know how you'd like to proceed. For the next few months, Ross has meetings with Rubin, Macklowe, and the Katz people, the invested time principle. Cost estimates are obtained, financial projections are created, space designers and architects are consulted, use of professionals. Ross is unable to convince Rubin to be more reasonable in his demands. Macklowe is anxious to make a deal, but balks when discussing the need for him to make cash expenditures. The executive board of the Katz agency, find the decision makers, convenes to decide what to do. Greenwald invites Ross to participate in the meeting. Final act, scene 1. Place, Greenwald's office after the heated board meeting. Present are Ross and Greenwald. Greenwald. George, you heard the board. They're against spending money to solve a space problem that may occur in 3 years. They're gung-ho for the merger that will cost us about $12 million, and we'll have to borrow it from a bank. They're concerned that if we take on major expenditures, the bank won't make the loan. I think they're right. Unless you can pull a rabbit out of a hat, we'll sit tight and make a deal with Rubin for the additional space we need because of the merger. If we can't make a deal with him, we'll operate out of 2 locations. I hate not to take advantage of a market opportunity, but unless you can come up with a viable alternative, we'll pay you for your time and effort and call you in a few years. Ross. I hear you loud and clear, but I still think I can rattle Rubin's cage so that he'll come up with a much fairer deal. I'd like to use Macklowe as leverage. There's no doubt that a deal with Rubin is the way to go if he's reasonable, but there's a slim possibility that I can structure a deal with Macklowe that the board will approve. Or even if they don't, I can use it as a wedge to get Rubin to lower his sights. Do I have your permission to try? Greenwald. Go to it, and good luck. You'll need it. Scene 2. Place. Ross goes back to his office to devise a plan to try to convince Macklowe to make a deal within the restrictions laid down by the Katz board. Necessary pre-planning. Before setting a meeting with Macklowe, Ross prepares a list of important questions, making an agenda before a meeting. 1. How can I make a deal with Macklowe where he advances all the money Katz needs for the move to Macklowe's building? Answer. Increase the rent to repay him. 2. How can I get Macklowe to take over the remaining obligations under the lease with Rubin? Answer. Quantify the exposure and blend it into the rent. 3. What assurance do I have that Macklowe will meet his monetary obligations? Answer. Insist on money up front as a condition of signing the lease. 4. I've been told that a major law firm has been negotiating to take a big block of space in Maclow's building, but the deal has stalled. Why? Answer: ask Maclow, or the head of the law firm, or both. 5. I'm going to ask for a low rent and huge monetary concessions from Maclow, and I know the approval of Maclow's mortgage holder will be required. How can I convince them to approve the deal? Answer: convince them a building with a less than ideal lease is better than sitting with an empty building at a time when tenants are scarce. 6. Does Maclow know I'm trying to make a deal with Reuben? Answer: assume he does, but try to juggle both deals. 7. How can I script this negotiation? Answer: you can't. There are too many variables. Just wing it. 8. What do I do if Reuben learns I'm dealing with Maclow? Answer: tell him that is because his deal is outrageous. And if he's reasonable, I'll make a deal with him. After carefully devising the answers to the questions Maclow will probably raise, Ross sets a meeting with Maclow. Ross tells him the Katz agency is ready to make a deal, and Ross thinks, although it's a highly unusual deal, perhaps he can convince Maclow it's a good one, even though he knows initially he won't like it. Aim high and you'll come out better. Scene 3. Place: Maclow's office. Present are Ross, Maclow, Maclow's CFO, and Maclow's lawyer. Ross to Maclow: Harry, I've gotten the Katz agency to carefully consider taking a lease in your building, but it will require several millions of dollars of upfront money from you. Maclow: George, to tell you the truth, since the building's been vacant so long, I haven't made any payments on my mortgage. If the lender wanted to, it could foreclose and own the building outright. The lender has agreed to give me an opportunity to salvage my investment by finding a deal they will approve. Ross just uncovered a hidden decision-maker. Any money you need to make the Katz deal must come from the lender. I can negotiate a deal and recommend it, but that's as far as I can go. Ross: let me outline the deal I think Katz will accept. Hear me out, and let's put our heads together to figure a way to induce your mortgagee to accept it. Here are the basic terms that Katz wants. I'll give you the bad news first. 1. Once Katz makes a deal with you, they want to be free of all financial obligations from the space covered by any Reuben lease. You'll have to assume all their monetary obligations under their leases. That means you'll have to quantify in your own mind the dollar value of Katz's exposure, taking into account the amount you think you can save by subletting or getting a release from Reuben. Then you'd have to agree to pay it when due and recoup it by increasing your rent. 2. Katz's architects figure that the installation Katz will make in your building will cost $8,750,000 more than your building standard. That excess will have to be funded by you, but can also be recouped by increasing the rent. 3. To be consistent with what is presently available in the marketplace, the basic rent must be $10 per square foot below your asking rent. 4. Katz needs $12 million to complete its merger and wants to borrow the money from you and repay it with interest over the term of the lease. Now for the good news. 1. Katz is a financially solid entity that has been in business since 1886. They are an excellent credit risk. 2. Katz is willing to sign a 15-year lease on space on the lower floors, which are the hardest for you to rent. This will enable you to make the deal you've been trying to make with the law firm for the upper floors. Between the two leases, the building will be almost 100% rented in a depressed market. 3. If I get the green light, I can finish the deal with you within 1 week, which means less lost time for you. 4. Using my relationships with your mortgage holder, the importance of building relationships, I think together we can convince them that increasing the amount of the mortgage by the money you need and having a 100% rented building is a much better position for the mortgagee than having a smaller mortgage on an empty building during a real estate recession of unknown duration. Maclow's attorney. There's no way that Reuben will consent to an assignment or cancellation of the leases in the Reuben building. How can Maclow get the benefits of any subletting of that space? Ross. The Katz Agency and Maclow could sign a takeover agreement, whereby Maclow is responsible for the rent Katz is obligated to pay under the Reuben lease. Katz would agree to make any sublease of the Reuben space that Maclow requests. The takeover agreement will be structured in such a way to protect Maclow and Katz from a default by either of them. Maclow to Ross. That's the wackiest deal I ever heard of. Ross to Maclow. I agree it's unusual, but I don't think it's wacky. What's your alternative? Is it better to sit with a vacant building and lose it to your mortgage lender? Maclow to his attorney. George has a point there. Draw up the papers, and let's see if we can make the deal work. Maclow to Ross. One thing I need from you. If I go through all these gymnastics and agree to make a deal, I want your promise that you won't go back to Reuben and make a deal with him. Ross. Once the paperwork has reached the level that I feel comfortable that we have a deal, I'll stop negotiating with Reuben. However, until that point, I still consider myself free to negotiate with Reuben. Create an incentive to move quickly. Ross, together with the Katz representatives, spend about 3 intensive weeks negotiating the documents containing the terms set out by Ross and verbally approved by Maclow. When the deal has reached the stage that Ross believes it will happen, Ross sets another meeting with Reuben. Scene 4. Place: Reuben's office. Present are Ross, Reuben, and Reuben's son. Ross. Larry, up to now, you've refused to budge from your prior negotiating position. As a courtesy, maintaining a relationship, I'm here to give you one more chance to change your mind, or you'll lose Katz as a tenant. Ross then tells Reuben the terms of the deal that Maclow is willing to make with Katz. Reuben to Ross. I don't believe that Maclow will honor any deal he makes. He hasn't got the money to do so. Ross. Larry, you've known me for a long time. If I say it can be done, then it can be done. If you doubt it, just stick to your position and watch what happens. Take it or leave it. Reuben to Ross. I don't care what you say. You'll never make that deal with Maclow. Ross leaves Reuben's office and calls Maclow and says, Harry, if you put our deal to bed, I promise you I'm through negotiating with Reuben. Maclow's deal with Katz is finalized and approved by Maclow's mortgage holder. Ross tells Greenwald to call a meeting of the board of directors of the Katz Agency to approve the Maclow deal. Greenwald calls the meeting, and Ross explains the advantages of the Maclow deal. 1. Katz gets the $12 million it needs to complete the merger and pays it back as part of the rent under the lease with Maclow. 2. Katz gets brand new space in a new prestigious Midtown office building. 3. Katz is protected from its exposure under the leases with Reuben. 4. The larger floor size of the Maclow building creates greater efficiency and a savings in the cost of operations of more than $1 million per year. The Katz board approves the Maclow deal. However, Reuben has a mole on the Katz board and learns of the approval of the Maclow deal. Reuben calls Ross. Reuben to Ross. George, I'm willing to meet the Maclow deal. Let's meet and work it out. Ross to Reuben. Larry, you had your chance, and you said I couldn't do what I said I could do. Now the ship has sailed, and you're not on board. Sorry, I gave my word to Maclow that if he honored his deal with me, I was through negotiating with you. Keep your commitments. Maybe next time you won't doubt my word. The end. Chapter 17. 6 Tactics for Increasing Your Power in a Negotiation. The recurring theme in Trump-style negotiation is looking for ways to satisfy both sides, to structure a deal so that everyone feels that he or she comes out a winner. I experienced an unusual example of this type of negotiation approach when I worked for Saul Goldman and Alex DiLorenzo Jr. in the 1960s. One day, an elderly, disheveled broker came into our offices and handed me a listing for an apartment building in Brooklyn Heights. It was for sale by a family who had built it 40 years before and owned it ever since. The asking price was $860,000. Not knowing whether it might be of interest to Saul Goldman, I showed him the listing. Saul knew all about the property and had tried to buy it years ago but was unsuccessful. He told me he would love to buy the property, and when I told him the asking price, he was shocked because it was so low. He told me to find out how many people the broker had already shown the listing to. So I spoke to the broker again, who told me we were the only real estate investors he'd come to, because we were well known as the #1 buyer of Brooklyn properties. When I told Goldman that, he said, "George, if this deal gets out in the market, there will be a bidding war for it. We have to avoid one and move quickly. Tell the broker I'll buy the property for $1 million. I said, "Saul, they're only asking $860,000. How can I justify $1 million? He told me, "Hey, you're the lawyer. You figure it out." I went back to the broker, who was still sitting in my office, and said, "My client likes the property, but there's a major problem. The price is too low." The broker didn't understand what I said, and he replied, "Well, I know they're asking $860,000, but I think they might sell it for $800,000. "You weren't listening to me," I told him. "The price is too low. If you raise the price to $1 million, you've got a deal. Just bring me a contract for that price, and I'll give you a check for $100,000 as a down payment, and we'll close in 30 days. The broker was thoroughly confused and asked me, why would anyone pay $1 million for something they could buy for $860,000? Reaching for a plausible explanation, I said, "My client is an eccentric millionaire, and he won't buy anything costing less than $1 million. That's his style. As I told you, if you come back to me with a contract for $1 million, I'm authorized to sign it and give you the down payment." The broker left my office like a shot and came back the next day with a contract, which I signed and gave him the $100,000 deposit. Now, the kicker was that before title passed, Goldman had lined up a non-recourse first mortgage on the property for $1.4 million from a bank. The bank thought it was worth at least that amount. Goldman took title with his own money, and a few months later I closed the loan with the bank without disclosing the original purchase price. By overpaying, Goldman had ensured that he would get the property quickly. With his instinct, he believed he knew the property's true value, and he was right. He made a great deal. If you approach negotiation with the idea that one side must win and the other side must lose, you're not using Trump-style negotiation. Your goal is not to squeeze everything you can out of the other side, but to create a deal they can live with. Both sides in this transaction got more than they were willing to accept, and both walked away feeling like winners. Whenever you can create that feeling, you are executing a Trump-style negotiation. With skill, creativity, and showmanship, you can turn adversaries into allies by showing them how it is possible to make a deal acceptable to both sides. The desired outcome is mutual satisfaction. The last step in explaining how Trump-style negotiation works is to summarize 6 of the most important deal-making techniques you can use. Mastering these basic fundamentals will guarantee you a higher success rate in closing mutually satisfying negotiations. 1. Keep exceptional records. Remember what I said earlier. The side that is more prepared in any negotiation has a better chance of winning. The notes you take during a negotiation serve as a defense against the other side raising new issues or contradicting themselves later. If you are able to refer to a specific discussion, including the date and what was said, you have a compelling argument. 2. Wherever possible, develop your own forms and create the aura of legitimacy. It is a truism that the side that prepares documents decides what goes in and what stays out. The aura of legitimacy is set by you presenting something for signature and authenticating it by saying something like, "This is what I used in a similar deal with GM. If they approved it, it should be fine with you." The existence of a contract, application, agreement, or other document carries the aura of legitimacy merely because it exists, and people have a tendency to believe the written word. 3. If you can, use company policy as a negotiating tool. If you represent a company in your negotiations, simply presenting the argument that is our company's policy will put an end to many arguments. Somehow, company policy is like a mandate from God. The other side is likely to realize there's no point in trying to change something as inflexible as company policy. They rarely probe to find out whether or not the policy in fact exists or is that inflexible. 4. Be willing to take calculated risks. You have to play to win. Taking risk may be reckless if you have not evaluated the risk and reward beforehand. But a calculated risk is worth taking if you are willing and able to live with the consequences. For example, if someone wants to delay the final stages of a negotiation, you can calculate that the other side has more to lose than you do by walking away. So it might be worth the risk of saying, "This is my best offer, take it or leave it." Successful negotiators are willing to take calculated risks. Suppose, for example, I make you the following offer. I've tossed this quarter 49 times, and it always came up heads. I'm willing to give you 100 to 1 odds that it will come up heads the 50th time as well. Now, you know the odds are 50-50, so you would jump at the opportunity, right? Let's change the scenario a bit. Assume that your total life savings is $200,000, and I say, I'll bet $20 million against your $200,000 that it will be heads again. The odds haven't changed, but the stakes have, and suddenly the possibility of losing everything becomes a reality. You begin to think, with my luck, it'll come up heads again and I'll be wiped out. You refused the bet, even though it was a well-calculated risk. Any negotiator who has the courage to take risks has an advantage over those who lack the courage to do so. 5. Use time as the ultimate negotiating weapon. Every negotiation has a time element involved in various phases of its development. As long as you are not forced to operate under a deadline governing your side, you can use time as a weapon to control the negotiation. When you are aware that the other side must end the discussion within a specific time and place, don't begin negotiating in earnest until the latest possible moment, because that's when the other side is most vulnerable to accepting your suggestions. You can also make effective use of delay as long as it furthers your agenda or makes the other side eventually come around to an agreement because they get tired of waiting. Deadlines, delays, and deadlocks are all time-related methods of negotiation. Figure out how to use each of these at appropriate times to enhance your negotiating power, and by all means avoid allowing the other side to use time against you. 6. Make and use general commitments to gain concessions. You can make promises to the other side of a general nature to gain the advantage. For example, you can say, "I promise that I'm going to see this through until we reach an agreement." This is a moral commitment to not walk away. But if you are going to make such a commitment, you should expect reciprocity. Keep in mind that you can choose to refute your moral commitment if circumstances so require. But if the other side does so, you can remind them of their agreement and get them to continue negotiating. The entire field of negotiation is merely the continual use of diverse methods to communicate ideas that will achieve a favorable result. Some people are effective motivators, and others are not. Some hold their cards close to their vest and carefully control what they do, say, or employ to impress others. Inept negotiators signal when they have a good hand or a poor hand by what they say, write, or the actions they take. Skilled negotiators are easy to deal with, but they get what they want. Your awareness of negotiation skills and tactics is essential to making the process work. You certainly don't want to find yourself in a situation where you're at a disadvantage. And if you do, find a way to delay the proceedings until you've had a chance to create a plan that can reverse that situation. In this book, I have provided you with a series of strategies, tactics, and skills worth mastering. Anyone who studies the philosophy of Trump-style negotiation will eventually be able to apply these skills in his or her own negotiations with other people. I never said it would be easy, but over time, you will create your own databank of what worked and what didn't. The ability to negotiate effectively is a worthwhile talent in any situation, industry, or organization. You will discover that it transcends your professional life and carries over into your personal life as well. You will be better equipped to deal with salespeople, friends, spouses, and children once you gain the insights into what people are really thinking when they say something. You will be much better equipped to be an effective salesperson because that's what a skilled negotiator is. Once you are able to recognize common errors or human nature, you will be a much better negotiator on every level. You're always negotiating. It never stops. Just remember this most important element of Trump-style negotiation. You can only achieve mutual satisfaction and complete the biggest and best deals when you build a relationship of trust and rapport with those with whom you become involved.